Hey everyone, welcome to another exciting adventure. Today, Audio Novel presents, Marvel, Am I Falling in Love? By Walker_. Wait, don't forget, supporting authors like Walker_ is what keeps these amazing stories alive. Show some love for their incredible work. And if you read advanced chapter, join authors' Patreon or Discord group, link available in video's description, don't forget to check out. And if you're looking for more amazing stories, don't forget to check out my Patreon page. Your support helps turn incredible tales like this one into fully immersive audiobooks. Join me on this journey, and together, we can bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of the adventure. Let's begin. Chapter 1, Origin of Everything. In New York. 2015. Okay, I know you've heard this story a million times, but here we go one more time. My name is Peter Parker. I got bitten by a radioactive spider during a school trip to Oscorp Industries when it escaped from a containment box where it was being studied. And for a year, I was the first and only Spider-Man. And the rest, you already know. With great power comes great responsibility, and inspired by these wise words from Uncle Ben, I decided to use my powers to combat the city's crime, becoming the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Anyway, I also saved the city from my crazy professor, Dr. Kurt Connors, who was conducting experiments with reptile DNA to cure his arm. He had injected himself with the serum containing lizard DNA samples, but he ended up getting so addicted to the drug that he turned into a giant lizard, whose desire was to turn all of humanity into lizards, claiming that this would be the next step in human evolution. It was pretty crazy. At this point, you might be wondering, where were the Avengers? Well, after that incident in New York, the Avengers disbanded, and each went their separate ways. However, after the events involving the Winter Soldier and Hydra's infiltration within S.H.I.E.L.D., Nick Fury, the former S.H.I.E.L.D. director, made the radical decision to reactivate the Avengers Initiative. After all these events, the Avengers returned to being Earth's mightiest heroes. And guess what? They're throwing a party at Stark Tower, and since I work for J.J. Jameson at the Daily Bugle, of course, I'm going. Was I invited? Well, the answer is no, but anyway, I'll be there as a professional to interview them, and who knows, maybe even get an autograph from Iron Man. In Queens. 6 p.m., Thursday. Peter was in his room, getting his camera ready for the interview at Stark Tower when the door opened gently, and his aunt walked in. "Oh, hi, Aunt May," said Peter, greeting his aunt with a warm smile on his face before turning his attention back to his camera. "Do you remember the party that Mr. Stark is organizing?" Peter continued, still focused on his camera. "Yes, I heard about it, but what does that have to do with you?" May Parker asked, still not understanding the question. After being questioned by May, Peter interrupted what he was doing with his camera and turned to answer his aunt. "Well, I was invited as one of the reporters," Peter said. After hearing all of that from her nephew, May adopted a worried look on her face. "So, are you really going?" May asked, still somewhat concerned. Peter looked at his aunt, noticing the concern on her face. He could understand why she was so worried. A superhero's life was full of dangers, and a party with the Avengers could easily turn into a confrontation with supervillains or unexpected threats. However, Peter tried to reassure his aunt with a comforting smile. "I know it may seem risky, Aunt May, but don't worry. I'll be careful and stay in my reporter role. I don't intend to get involved in any trouble," Peter said, trying to reassure his aunt. "Besides, you know that ever since I was a kid, my dream has always been to meet the Avengers, especially Iron Man." Peter continued, now a little more excited. "Peter, I know you're excited about this, but I just want you to promise me that you'll be careful. And no wandering around aimlessly," May said, sighing, still worried but trusting her nephew. "I promise, Aunt May. I won't do anything reckless. I'll be there just to do my job as a reporter, get some good stories, and maybe, if the opportunity arises, get an autograph from Iron Man." Peter reassured his aunt, with a big smile on his face. Aunt May smiled, still somewhat apprehensive, but realizing her nephew's genuine enthusiasm, she just smiled and replied, "All right, Peter. I trust you. Just promise me that you'll stay safe and won't get into any trouble." Peter affectionately hugged his aunt and then said, "I promise, Aunt May. And don't worry, I always come back home." "Aunt, I have to go now, or I'll be late and won't make it to the subway in time to catch the train," Peter said, picking up his backpack and giving his aunt a hug. "All right, you can go. Just remember to be sensible, young man," May said as she pinched Peter's cheeks. "You got it, Aunt May," Peter said. Peter was in a hurry not to miss his train, so he quickly headed for the door of his house, with evident haste in every step he took. Upon leaving the house, Peter began to make his way toward public transportation. He walked briskly along the city sidewalks. As he approached the station, he took a cell phone from his pocket and checked the time. Observing the illuminated display, he noticed he had only a few precious minutes before the next train departed. After boarding the train, Peter headed to the city center, where he encountered Avengers Tower. Since there was a large crowd gathered in front of the building, Peter ended up being stopped by one of the security guards who prevented him from entering. "Please stop right there, kid. What's your name?" a tall man with an unfriendly demeanor asked, blocking Peter's entrance. Upon being confronted by the security guard, Peter promptly responded while displaying his identification badge and firmly holding his camera. "My name is Peter Parker, I work as a reporter at the Daily Bugle." The security guard examined the badge and the camera, apparently assessing the legitimacy of Peter's information. After a brief moment of suspicion, he finally relented and allowed the young man to enter. You can go in," the man said, still maintaining a cautious gaze but granting Peter the opportunity to explore the interior of the Avengers Tower. "Thanks, buddy. You have no idea how much you've helped me just now." Peter expressed his gratitude. The security guard, though keeping a serious expression, nodded in acknowledgement. "You better get in quickly before I change my mind," he warned, emphasizing the importance of not lingering. "Thanks, I will," Peter replied, in a hurry and with a relieved smile on his face as he hastened his steps toward the entrance of the Avengers Tower. He could hardly wait to explore the interior and perhaps capture an interesting story for the Daily Bugle. Chapter 2, Meeting the Black Widow. Inside Stark Tower. A few minutes later. 6:30 p.m. As Peter enters the building, he immediately heads to the elevator and presses the button to go up. His heart is racing with excitement as he's about to meet his heroes in person. Wow, it would be incredible to be an Avenger. Just imagine, me fighting alongside Earth's mightiest heroes. Peter whispers to himself as his eyes sparkle with the idea. But that's impossible, stop dreaming, Parker. They would never call a kid from Queens to join the world's greatest superhero organization. That would be crazy, and they're not crazy. I can't believe I'm actually going to meet Captain America, Thor, Black Widow, and Iron Man. Peter thinks with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. He can't believe he's about to meet Earth's mightiest heroes, the Avengers. He tries to compose himself, he doesn't want to look like a fool in front of them. The next time I meet Jameson, I have to express my gratitude to him, even if he's a pain sometimes. It's because of his help that I'm going to fulfill my dream. Peter whispers softly to himself. As the elevator doors open, Peter is greeted with an impressive sight, a massive room filled with people. There are reporters with microphones and cameras, elegantly dressed guests with forced smiles, and in the midst of it all, he sees them. They're the Avengers, Earth's most powerful heroes, whom he admires so much. Peter feels a knot in his stomach and a twinkle in his eyes as he enters the room and walks toward them. Along the way, he is approached by Maria Hill, Nick Fury's loyal assistant, the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. "Hi, can I know who you are?" Agent Hill asks, looking the young man up and down. "Excuse me, I'm Peter Parker, a reporter and photographer for the Daily Bugle." Peter replies, showing his press badge. "Ah, I see. As you may have noticed, the Avengers are all busy right now, which makes everything even more challenging, so I can't guarantee anything. However, I might be able to help you get a photo or something. What do you think?" Maria Hill says, trying to find a solution to assist the young man. "I would be very grateful for your help. And I apologize for my ignorance, but could you please tell me your name?" Peter asks, slightly embarrassed. "Don't worry, I'm Agent Maria Hill, right hand and trusted person of Mr. Fury, the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. Agent Hill responds while shaking the young man's hand. "Thank you very much, Ms. Hill," Peter says, accepting her handshake. "You're welcome. Go to that person over there, and she will grant you the interview you're looking for." Agent Hill points to a bar where the heroine Natasha Romanoff, also known as Black Widow, is seated. I'm very grateful, Ms. Hill. I don't even know how to thank you. Peter says. Has anyone ever told you that you talk too much, kid? Go there quickly before she changes her mind, and you miss this one opportunity. Maria Hill says, looking at Peter. I'm sorry, I didn't even notice. With an embarrassed sigh, Peter apologizes to Agent Hill and slowly walks away, heading toward Black Widow. Peter, with a confident look, walks toward the bar where Natasha is. She is wearing a red dress with golden accents. She is sitting on one of the bar stools, enjoying a glass of whiskey. Peter gets closer and closer to Romanoff, his steps echoing in the now silent bar. Good evening, Miss Romanoff. Peter says, greeting a petite woman with a sculpted body. Good evening. And who are you? Natasha asks with a puzzled face. I apologize for my lack of manners. My name is Peter Parker, I work as a reporter and photographer for the Daily Bugle. I'm here to take some photos and, if possible, conduct an interview for the newspaper. Peter replies as he introduces himself to Black Widow. Peter notices the intense gaze that Natasha is giving him. Oh, did I say something wrong? Peter asks, not understanding Natasha's look. Well, we just defeated Hydra, and I wanted to make sure you're not a spy in disguise. You know, it's always better to be safe than sorry. Natasha responds, looking at Peter. I completely understand, Miss Romanoff. Peter says with a somewhat nervous smile. Earth security is obviously a priority, especially for such an important group like the Avengers. Peter continues, now less nervous. Upon hearing my words, Natasha begins to assess my response before relaxing a bit, perhaps realizing that I pose no threat. She takes a sip of her whiskey and then looks at me again. All right, Mr. Parker, I'll trust your word for now. But be aware that I'll be keeping an eye on you. Natasha says, giving me a penetrating look that makes it clear she's not joking. Of course, Miss Romanoff, I'm at your disposal for anything you need. Peter says while maintaining a respectful tone of voice. Natasha gets up from the bar stool, takes her whiskey glass, and gives me a slight smile. Well, now that we understand each other, what would you like to know? Agent Romanoff says as she settles into the bar chair. Well, to start our conversation, how about you tell me how you, the Avengers, managed to defeat Hydra? Peter says as he begins a brief interview. Natasha nods in approval and starts sharing details about the recent mission. As she talks, I can't help but admire her confidence and grace, even after an intense battle. I do my best to stay focused and make mental notes. As the conversation continues, Natasha proves to be a great interviewee, answering my questions clearly and concisely. When we finally finish the interview, Natasha smiles at me and says, I hope you got what you needed, Peter. It was a pleasure talking to you. The pleasure was all mine, Miss Romanoff. Peter says, thanking Natasha. Chapter 3, The Maximoff Brothers. In Sokovia. 2015. At the same time, Wanda and Pietro Maximoff were twin siblings who experienced an unimaginable tragedy when they lost their parents in a devastating incident. The house they lived in was struck by a missile manufactured by Stark Industries. This traumatic event marked the beginning of a deep and lasting hatred for Stark, which intensified when they discovered that Stark had become the country's leading arms manufacturer. After the catastrophic events that occurred in New York in 2012, they made the decision to volunteer for experiments conducted by the Hydra organization. Hydra was conducting research on the Mind Stone, an artifact of unimaginable power. In that facility, Wanda and Pietro were subjected to inhumane conditions. They went through a true hell, being tortured and treated like animals. Food was scarce, and often they had to make do with the bare minimum to survive. However, despite the terrible circumstances, they chose this life rather than facing the dangerous streets of Sokovia. In that place, daily survival was a constant uncertainty. They were willing to endure anything, even the most brutal conditions, if it meant a chance to escape life on the streets and perhaps, just perhaps, have the opportunity to live one more day. On a specific day, Wanda realized that the Mind Stone seemed to be trying to establish a connection with her. During this communication, she caught a glimpse of the silhouette of a mysterious woman. The woman had long red hair and wore a red suit with black details. She seemed to be enveloped in a bright yellow light. However, after that experience, she never managed to see the image of that woman again. And everything changed when the Hydra base was invaded by the Avengers, forcing Wanda and her brother to flee the place. Despite the vision being brief and fleeting, the image of that woman remained etched in Wanda's mind. However, no matter how hard she tried, she never saw the woman again after that event. Another question lingered in Wanda's mind. Who was she? What did that vision mean? Was the Mind Stone trying to deceive her? These questions haunted her for a long time. After the Avengers' invasion of the Hydra base, my brother and I were left with nowhere to go and were forced to return to our hometown in Sokovia. It was a place where we had many memories and painful reminders that we would prefer to forget. The streets of that city were filled with painful memories that the Maximoff siblings had to confront after losing their parents. However, we didn't have many options. We only had two choices: continue to serve as subjects for Hydra's experiments or perhaps face an even worse fate. Besides, this was the only place we knew. And we hoped to find some kind of refuge there, or maybe lead a normal life. Wanda thought as she walked through the wreckage of the city alongside her brother. How good it is to be home. Pietro said, relieved, with an excited smile on his face. Aha. Wanda replied, a bit despondent and nervous. Wanda, are you okay? Pietro asked, getting his sister's attention. I'm fine, just a little lost in thought. Did we really make the right decision letting Stark have the stone? What if this results in more problems? Will we be held responsible? These thoughts won't leave my mind. Wanda replied, looking down. Pietro, who was listening carefully to everything his sister was saying, let out a sigh and said, I warned you, but you didn't want to listen to me. Now, there's nothing more we can do, they must be very far away, and not even my speed would be of great help. Pietro gently touched his sister's face in an attempt to reassure her and spoke. You don't need to worry, I won't allow anything bad to happen to you. After all, as your older brother, it's my responsibility to protect my dear little sister. Thank you. Wanda said, giving her brother a long hug. Suddenly, a newspaper was carried by the wind and passed between them. With quick and precise reflexes, Pietro reached out and managed to catch the newspaper before it flew away. As he picked up the newspaper, Pietro found an article that caught his attention and began to read it. A real threat to everyone, an individual known as Spider-Man nearly brought the metropolis of New York to complete destruction. He found himself battling a mad scientist who, after a failed experiment, transformed into a giant lizard. Their battle was so intense and chaotic that it caused extensive damage to the city, with buildings collapsing and streets completely destroyed. Wasn't this Spider-Man guy here when the Avengers came? Pietro asked, somewhat confused, to his sister. Who is this Spider-Man? I've never heard of him before. Wanda replied to her brother, deep in thought. Neither have I, but based on what I just read here, he seems quite strong. After all, he managed to defeat this creature that turned into a giant lizard all by himself. That alone requires great strength and remarkable skill. Pietro said, pondering as he responded to his sister. Yeah. Wanda said, still staring at the newspaper, completely immersed. Haven't you ever thought about it, Wanda? Imagine if we could do what he does, save people. It would be incredible. Finally, we would have the chance to use our powers for good. We could make a difference in the world, help people, and no longer be a threat. Pietro said, excited. Yeah. Wanda replied, still looking at the newspaper, lost in thought. Spider-Man, it's intriguing how you've sparked this new interest in me. I can't quite identify what it is, but there's something about you that makes me want to know more. Maybe it's your courage, or your determination, I don't know what it is. But whatever it is, you've certainly captured my attention. Wanda thought, not understanding the new feeling she was experiencing at that moment. Chapter 4, Getting to Know the Avengers, 1. In the Avengers Tower. Sometime later. 7:10 p.m. So, Miss Romanoff, could you share with us your experience of being a part of the Avengers? Peter asks while sitting at the bar counter. Well, it's fun and quite stressful at the same time. After all, having to put up with Stark almost all day isn't an easy task. Natasha says, taking a short pause and looking at Peter before continuing. But despite all that, we still stick together as a team, always looking out for each other. And that also includes dealing with Stark's big ego. Natasha adds with an ironic smile on her face. But how do you feel about being the only woman on the team? Peter asks, jotting something down in his notebook. I actually find it pretty cool, especially now with Agent Hill joining the team. However, I still surprise myself by realizing that I'm more skilled and smarter than all of them. Natasha responds to Peter's question. Peter listens attentively to everything Natasha says and, with a friendly smile on his face, replies. I understand. Well, that was all. I don't want to take up too much of your time. And thank you very much for taking some time to do this interview. You're welcome, it's always a pleasure to help out a fan. Natasha says, expressing her words while gently sliding her hand over Peter's arm. That unexpected touch caused a certain nervousness and shyness in the young man. He begins to feel a bit uncomfortable, but at the same time intrigued by Black Widow's actions. Oh, that's nice. Peter says, expressing his words, his face turning red with embarrassment. He was caught off guard, something that rarely happens, and it made him a little uneasy. With her perceptiveness, Natasha notices a subtle change in the boy's expressions. His words, which were previously full of confidence, now carry a tone of discomfort and nervousness. She sees the unease on his face, a clear sign that the play had gone too far. Understanding the situation, she decides to act. With a quick movement, she withdraws her hand from Peter's arm. In an attempt to ease the boy's discomfort a bit, Natasha says, Peter, you seem like a nice young man. Anyway, I suggest you go interview the others before they consume too much alcohol and it becomes nearly impossible to conduct an interview. Thank you very much, Miss Romanoff. It was a pleasure to have met you. Peter says, thanking Natasha for the time she spent talking to him. The pleasure was all mine. Natasha says, watching Peter slowly walk away. Parker. Why does that name sound familiar to me? Where have I heard that name before? Natasha thinks, still watching Peter getting farther away. As he leaves the area, Peter starts walking towards the other side of the room, where Hawkeye, one of Natasha's teammates, is currently comfortably seated on the couch. Hawkeye, absorbed in his own thoughts, is sitting quietly on the couch with a glass in his hand. Good evening, Mr. Clint. Peter asks as he approaches Barton. That's me. What would you like to know? Clint asks as he looks at the young man standing in front of him. Sorry for my rudeness, my name is Peter Parker, I work for the Daily Bugle. Would it be possible to grant an interview or maybe even a photo for our newspaper? Peter says with a friendly smile, extending his hand toward Clint. Clint, who was comfortably seated on the couch, gives Peter a quick look, who is standing in front of him. He begins to analyze the young man's facial expressions, trying to determine if he could be a spy. However, upon noticing the sincerity in his face and the press badge hanging around his neck, Clint feels more at ease in the young man's presence. Peter Parker, huh? Clint says, getting up from the couch. Yes, Mr. Clint. Peter replies respectfully. However, Clint intervenes gently, preferring a more informal approach. No, Mr. Please, just Clint is fine. Clint says with a friendly smile. While the conversation between Peter and Clint continues, a figure approaches quietly, moving with graceful steps. His eyes are filled with curiosity to find out who Clint is talking to. Upon noticing his friend's presence, Clint decides to call him. Hey, Bruce, come over here really quick. Clint says, calling Bruce. What's up, Clint? Bruce asks as he approaches Peter and Clint. Could you take a picture of us here for the kid and the newspaper he works for? Clint points to Peter. Sure, what's your name? Banner asks, looking at the young man in front of him. My name is Peter Parker, and I work for the Daily Bugle. It's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Banner. Peter says, shaking Bruce's hand. Your work on anti-electron collisions is unmatched. I'm a big fan of yours. I can say I like Dr. Banner more than the Hulk. Peter expresses his admiration to Banner. Ah, thanks. Bruce says as he takes the camera from Peter's hand. Actually, the photo I need to take is just of Mr. Clint. Unfortunately, I can't appear in the photo for professional reasons. Orders from my boss. Peter says, looking at Bruce and Clint and then continues. But I can take a photo of you two together. Sounds good. Bruce and Clint say together. So, it's all set. Peter says as he takes the camera from Banner's hands and positions himself to take a photo of them. He adjusts the camera settings and frames both of them in the camera's viewfinder. With a nod, he signals to Bruce and Clint to get closer to each other. They comply, and Peter captures the moment with a click of the shutter. Ready. Peter says after taking the photo, and he turns his attention to Clint and Bruce. This one's definitely going in the newspaper. Thank you for taking some of your time. Peter continues, now focusing his attention on the camera lens. Chapter 5, Getting to Know the Avengers, 2. No problem, we're here for whatever you need. Clint says, patting Peter on the shoulder. Yeah, if it interests you, Steve is up there with Sam, and you can interview him. Bruce says, extending his arm and pointing in the direction where Captain America was engrossed in conversation with Falcon. As for Tony and his big ego, he's over there on the other side of the room, chatting with Thor. Bruce continues, extending his arm again, this time pointing to the other side of the room where Iron Man and the God of Thunder were. Got it, thanks for the information, Dr. Banner. Peter says, thanking Bruce. No problem, kid. Bruce accepts Peter's gratitude with a handshake. What a cool kid, huh? Bruce asks Clint. After Peter moves away from where he was, he began to make his way toward where Captain America and Sam Wilson, also known as Falcon, were. He had a clear purpose, which was to interview both of them. For sure, but I just think he should loosen up a bit more. He needs to control his nerves better. But despite that, he's a good kid. Clint responds to Bruce's question. Peter approaches slowly to where Steve Rogers and Wilson were. Good evening. Peter says, getting the attention of Rogers and Wilson. Good evening, young man. Need something? Steve asks, looking at Peter. My name is Peter Parker, and I work as a photographer for the Daily Bugle. Could you grant me an interview or a photo? Peter asks, looking at Steve and Sam. What do you think, Steve? Wilson asks, looking at Steve. I'm not a big fan of giving interviews, but maybe, who knows, a photo. Steve replies, looking at Peter. All right, you have no idea how important this is to me, I mean, to the newspaper, not to me. Peter says, realizing what he said and getting embarrassed. Feel free to ask any questions you want. Steve says, standing up and looking at Peter. I understand. Mr. Captain America, could you tell me what it's like to be a part of the Avengers, the world's greatest organization? Peter asks, taking out his phone from his pocket to record the interview. No need for the Mr., just Steve. Well, after I was frozen for 75 years, everything became new to me. This new world, with the existence of gods and aliens, is so different from what I knew, where I know almost nothing. I'm not sure if you can understand. Steve says, looking at Peter, who was listening carefully to everything Rogers said while taking notes in his notebook. I understand, and how do you feel knowing that you were frozen for 75 years? And that the world is not the same as you remembered? Peter asks Rogers, still writing the interview report in the notebook he carried in his pocket. It's quite strange. Rogers says, pausing briefly before continuing. It's hard to describe the feeling. Imagine waking up from a long dream, but that dream was basically your entire life. 75 years is an incredibly long time, and the world I see now is a very different place from what it was before. As Steve spoke, Peter, who was listening attentively, wrote down every detail of the conversation in his notebook. Seeing this, Rogers continued. Everything has changed, technology, politics, people. I'm still trying to adjust to this new reality. It's both exciting and quite scary at the same time. Many friends and comrades are gone, and I still miss them. But at the same time, I see this as a new opportunity to do things differently. Rogers lets out a long sigh before continuing. But one thing in me hasn't changed, and that's my commitment to fight for justice and protect those who can't defend themselves. I believe that, no matter how different the world is, there will always be room for people willing to do what's right. After Rogers finished speaking, Peter carefully noted the course the conversation had taken in his notebook, knowing he was witnessing a unique moment in history, the perspective of a man out of his time but still faithful to his principles and moral code, honor, integrity, and courage. Basically, that's it. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Peter says, before continuing a bit embarrassed. Thanks to you, Captain, I'll be able to write a great article for the newspaper. Calm down, kid, no need to be so excited. Wilson says, trying to calm down the embarrassed Peter. It was a tremendous pleasure to talk to you. Peter says, shaking hands with Steve and then shaking hands with Wilson. The pleasure was all ours. Steve and Wilson say together as they accept Peter's greeting and shake the young man's hand. As he says goodbye to Steve and Wilson, Peter slowly walks away from them. With a final wave and a friendly smile, he leaves them behind. His footsteps echoed in the silence of the place as he walked toward Thor and Tony, who were a little further ahead, chatting peacefully, probably with Tony bragging about something, as usual. The kid has talent, he just needs to work on his nervousness. Wilson says to Steve. Yeah, he seems to have a good heart. Steve says, still thinking about Peter. Lucky me. I managed to get 2 interviews and even secure a photo for the front page of the newspaper. Peter thought as he approached Tony and Thor. Chapter 6, Conflicts. Good evening. Peter says shyly as he approaches where Tony and Thor were. Who are you? Tony asks, wanting to know who the young man who had approached them was. My name is Peter Parker, I work as a reporter at the Daily Bugle, I wanted. Peter was saying before being interrupted by Stark. I already know, a photo or an interview, your fame has spread around here, kid. Tony says sarcastically, interrupting Peter while looking at him. Hearing that from you is very inspiring for me, Mr. Stark. Peter says, looking at Tony. But that wasn't a compliment. Tony says indifferently. Oh. Peter says, not understanding. It's nothing personal, kid, but I'm not like the others, I don't give interviews or take photos for just anyone, and I certainly won't spend my precious time giving an interview to a newspaper that defamed us when we were putting our lives on the line to save theirs. Tony says, somewhat agitated, looking at Peter. Tony, try to calm down. Thor says, trying to calm Tony. Furthermore, considering your abilities, it's surprising to see a talented young man like you wasting time at that newspaper when you could be working at a higher level, do you understand what I mean? Tony says, raising his voice a bit. Stay calm, Tony. Thor looks at Tony. Tony, who was visibly upset, his words laden with concern were evident in his voice as he spoke. No, there's no calm, and furthermore, if he's a man, he'll put everything I've said here in the article without leaving anything out. At that moment, Steve approaches where Tony was, accompanied by Natasha. Their arrival added a new dimension to the situation because no one knew what might happen now. What's going on here? Steve asks as he approaches Tony. Oh, of course, as if you didn't know what's going on here, Captain. Tony says sarcastically, pointing to Peter before continuing. It seems like you guys don't understand, but this guy is trying to sell our photos and interviews to a newspaper whose only goal is to defame us. Without a doubt, tomorrow this will be headlines all over New York as a big story. The Avengers, instead of protecting our city, are throwing a party while people suffer from thefts, wars, and deaths. Tony says, already upset. Try to calm down, Tony. Steve holds Tony's shoulder. Don't ask me to stay calm, and you. Tony points to Peter before continuing. Get out of here now, and never set foot in this tower again while you're working for that liar. As he listened to every word his idol said, Peter felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He lowered his head, allowing his curls to fall over his forehead, partially hiding his face. A look of sadness began to appear on his face, his eyes showing a mixture of disappointment. Tasha, please, take the kid out of here. Steve looks at Natasha. You got it. Natasha confirms, taking Peter's arm before continuing. Come with me. Okay. Peter says, still feeling disheartened. As they headed for the elevator, Natasha chose to start a conversation with Peter in an attempt to make him feel more at ease. I'm sorry for everything Tony said. Natasha says, still looking ahead. No need to apologize, you guys are not to blame for anything. In fact, I should apologize to you. Peter says, still with his head down. Don't take it to heart, Tony is like that, but he doesn't mean any harm. Natasha tries to cheer Peter up. I know, but I just wanted to hear, maybe, something positive, from the person I admire. Peter said calmly and softly before continuing to whisper, almost unnoticed by Natasha. But it seems that, besides not being welcome here, I'll never be either. But you weren't planning to write a story that would defame Tony or us, were you? Natasha asks, almost hesitating. No, I would never do something like that. I admire you guys a lot. I even wanted to be part of the team. Peter says excitedly. What do you mean? Natasha asks, somewhat confused. In fact, I didn't mean that. I just wanted to say that I usually only take photos of Spider-Man, and even then, Jameson keeps badmouthing him, even though I don't like it. Peter says, stumbling over his words, trying to clear up the misunderstanding. I've heard of this Spider-Man guy, but I've never seen him. Do you know him? Natasha asks with a curious look while looking at Peter. Well, I don't know him personally, I just take photos of him, that's all. Peter says somewhat embarrassed. Natasha murmurs with a tone of suspicion in her voice. As they approached the elevator, Natasha observed the metal door sliding smoothly until it opened automatically. Peter, without hesitation, took a step forward and entered the well-lit elevator space. Natasha, who until that brief moment had been in complete silence, decided to break the silence with a soft voice as she said goodbye to Peter. Well, you can get home by yourself, right? Natasha asks, breaking the awkward silence. Yes, I can, and I thank you very much for everything, Miss Romanoff. Peter responds, nodding his head. You're welcome. Natasha accepts Peter's thanks. Goodbye. Peter says goodbye to Natasha. See you later. Natasha also says goodbye to Peter. Natasha watched attentively as the elevator door slowly closed. She was on the top floor of the tower, leaning against the iron bars that surrounded that small space, with her posture still upright. Her focus was entirely directed downward, where Peter had already left the tower and was now standing outside. She gave one last look to the young man, who was moving further away with quick steps. As Peter slowly moved away from Stark Tower, he was immersed in his thoughts. His gaze remained fixed on nothing, but his mind was racing. Chapter 7, Ultron. Inside the tower. 19:30 p.m. After escorting Peter to the elevator and seeing the doors close, Natasha turns around and returns to the room where everyone had gathered. He's gone. Natasha says with a serious expression on her face as she walks slowly towards everyone in the room. I just hope he doesn't publish anything in the newspaper speaking ill of us, Tony says, with a concerned look on his face, raising his voice slightly. Tony, you could have been easier on the kid, Bruce said, looking at Tony. Banner, don't even start, Tony said, already somewhat agitated before continuing. I tried to control myself, but I couldn't stand that newspaper anymore. So why didn't you go to the newspaper and confront his boss instead of getting angry at the kid who's innocent in this story? Thor questions Tony, not understanding the situation. Tony was visibly frustrated with the situation. He began to speak hesitantly, searching for words to express his dissatisfaction. However, faced with the difficulties of arguing with Thor, Tony finally decided it was better to leave the room. His expression of disappointment and the way he paused before making that decision clearly indicated his frustration and helplessness in the situation. I hope the kid understands, Steve said with a concerned tone in his voice. On the streets of New York. At the same time. Congratulations, Parker, Peter says with a despondent tone in his voice before continuing. You just wasted your only chance to join the Avengers. But I didn't have a chance to join anyway. As he walked through the streets of New York, Peter took his camera out of his backpack, his eyes showing a hint of sadness and disappointment. He accessed the photo gallery and began to examine the pictures he had taken at the party. At least I'll have this as memories of this day, Peter said, with a bitter smile forming on his face as he looked at the photos. Back at the Avengers Tower. The party had already come to an end, and all the guests had left. Only the Avengers, Agent Hill, and scientist Helen Cho remained. They were chatting and attempting to lift Thor's hammer in a friendly competition. However, no one could lift the hammer even an inch. Then it was Captain America's turn. He managed to move the hammer a bit, but this went unnoticed by everyone except Thor, who interrupted them, saying they couldn't lift the hammer because they weren't worthy of it. When everyone was getting ready to leave, a loud noise echoed through the room. When they looked back, they were met with a surprising sight, a robot, completely destroyed and patched up with parts from other robots. The robot seemed to be trying to communicate with them, but all its efforts were in vain as the sounds it made were unintelligible. However, after many attempts, it finally managed to say something. "Worthy," the robot said, and its voice echoed throughout the room before continuing. "No. How could you be worthy?" The robot continued, its battered shell barely holding up, before going on. "If you're all killers." "Stark," Steve said, looking at Tony with a serious look. "Jarvis." Tony called out to Jarvis, but without success. "Sorry, I was asleep," the robot said, almost falling, and then continuing. "Or was I dreaming?" "Jarvis." Tony insisted before continuing. "Initiate the Legion system reboot, it seems we have a defective suit here." "I can't remember anything," the robot said, keeping its gaze fixed on the Avengers, before continuing. "Except for the hellish noise the other guy made when I had to kill him." He continued before pausing. "He was kinda cool." "You killed someone?" Steve asked with a still serious expression. "It wasn't my first choice, Captain," the robot replied with a brief pause before continuing. "But, in the real world, we have to make tough decisions." "Who sent you?" Thor asked, looking at the robot. The robot, with its voice programmed to play its last recordings, delivered a message in Tony's voice, "I see a suit of armor around the world." Upon hearing those words being played by the robot, everyone in the room turned their eyes to Stark. Upon hearing those words being played by the robot, Bruce automatically shifted his gaze to Tony and said, "Ultron." "That's right, in the flesh," Ultron said, looking at Bruce before continuing. "No, not yet, not in this empty shell." While Ultron spoke, tension spread throughout the room. Everyone was preparing for a possible attack. Thor held his hammer, Agent Hill had her gun ready, and everyone else was on high alert. "But I'm ready," Ultron said, with his voice echoing throughout the room, before continuing. "Ready for my mission." "What mission?" Natasha asked, already preparing herself. "Peace in our time," Ultron said, turning his head to the Avengers. Suddenly, a series of robots violently burst through the walls. On the streets of New York. At the same time, as Peter patiently waited at the bus stop for the next bus, his eyes were completely focused on the bustling city street, watching the people passing by. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the city, causing everyone to stop and look. The sound seemed to come from the Avengers Tower. "Should I go take a look?" Peter wondered as he looked at the Avengers Tower. Then he added, "But I'm not welcome there." "But Spider-Man is," Peter said as he looked at his reflection on his cell phone. In the midst of the crowd, Peter quietly walked into a dark and deserted alley. He opened his backpack, took out his suit, and put it on. With a quick and precise movement, he attached his backpack to the wall of the alley and shot a web toward the top of the building. Suddenly, a robot came at him. Peter managed to dodge it in time and delivered a blow to the robot. Seeing that the robot was about to fall, he shot a web that attached it to the building. "Sorry, old tin can, but today is recycling day," Peter said as he shot a web towards the building's window. Chapter 8, Attack on Avengers Tower. In the Avengers Tower. A few minutes later. 7:50 p.m. Amidst the chaos of the battle, Steve grabs the nearest table and uses it as a shield to defend himself against the robots. Meanwhile, Thor, using a powerful strike, manages to knock down one of the robots with his hammer, but Rhodes wasn't as lucky and ended up getting hit by a robot, which threw him back with the force of the impact, sending him to the second floor. Clint hides under the stairs, and Bruce and Natasha take cover behind the counter. While Bruce was on top of Natasha, she says something. "Don't turn green, please." "I'll try," Bruce nods in agreement. In the midst of all that confusion, one of the robots manages to advance and grab Loki's scepter, which contained the Mind Stone. Meanwhile, Natasha manages to hit one of the robots, causing a momentary distraction. Seizing this opportunity, Steve makes an agile move and jumps on top of the robot, trying to immobilize it with a rear-naked choke. However, the robot resists and manages to throw Steve against the wall. Without wasting time, Tony also jumps on top of the robot, following Steve's example. Meanwhile, Thor uses his superhuman strength to dismantle one of the robots. "Stark!" Thor shouts as he destroys another robot. Just a second, I'm almost done. Tony replies as he inserts a pen into the robot's neck. A robot without its lower parts was moving towards Dr. Cho, about to attack her. However, before it could complete its attack, an unexpected event occurs. The glass behind Dr. Cho shatters, hitting the robot directly. It's Spider-Man, who had launched a web to prevent the robot from killing the scientist. He then jumps into the tower, grabs the robot with his hands, and splits it in half. Today, apparently, is not my lucky day. Spider-Man murmurs as he enters the tower. Who are you? Steve asks, looking at the young man dressed in red in front of him. I just want everyone to know that I'm here to help. Spider-Man replies, throwing the dismembered robot to the ground. Ultron thinks as he looks at the new guest. Steve, in turn, manages to grab one of the approaching robots and, with a quick and strong motion, throws it towards Thor, who manages to destroy it by hitting it with his hammer. Meanwhile, Clint spots Captain America's shield lying on the ground. With agility and precision, he picks up the shield and throws it to Steve, who reaches out and catches the shield in the air and throws it again towards another robot. Stark had managed to deactivate one of the robots. I did it, I found where to shut it down. Tony says as he deactivates the robot by inserting a pen into its neck, but he falls onto glass shards in the process. Meanwhile, Natasha and Bruce were under attack from another robot. Seeing this, Steve throws his shield. Peter, with his spider-like agility, leaps and grabs the shield in midair. Without wasting time, he throws it back with even more force, managing to destroy the last robot. That was dramatic. Ultron says, taking a pause before continuing. I'm sorry, you're not bad people, you just don't think straight. At this moment, Steve approaches a little closer to where everyone was. You want to protect the world, but you don't want it to change. So, how will humanity be saved if you don't evolve? Ultron says, picking up a completely destroyed robot carcass from the floor before continuing. Like these puppets, there's only one path to peace. Ultron looks at everyone present in the room and says, Your extinction, Avengers. After uttering those words, Thor, who couldn't take it anymore, ends up throwing Mjolnir towards Ultron, destroying him, and the hammer then returns to Thor's hands. Hey! Spider-Man says somewhat awkwardly as he approaches them. Who are you? Thor asks a young man dressed in red in front of him. I'm Spider-Man. Peter replies, looking at Thor. Tony, who was sitting on the stairs with his arm all cut due to a fall on glass shards, gets up with some difficulty. He points at the young man and, with a curious expression, says, Who? Tony throws the question out there, waiting for someone to respond. He's the vigilante everyone's talking about, the one who saved the city from the giant lizard when we were taking down the Hydra base and rescuing the Maximoff twins. Natasha explains in response to Tony's question. Well, since things around here are already settled, I think I'll be on my way. Peter says, bidding farewell to everyone as he turns to leave. Easy there, pal. Who are you really? Tony asks, stopping Peter from leaving. Sorry, but I can't reveal that. Peter replies to Tony's question. Do you know us? Steve asks the shield on his back, looking at Peter. How could I not know the greatest heroes on Earth? Peter says with a slightly excited voice. So, why don't you show your face? Thor asks. There's no reason not to. Peter responds. Because there's no need for it. Clint, who had been silent until now, decides to say something. Of course, there is. Let's take off that mask already. Thor was starting to get irritated, and on impulse, he throws his hammer at Peter. To everyone's surprise, Spider-Man manages to dodge the hammer, which ends up going through a wall before returning to Thor's hands. Thor, surprised, looks at Peter and says, How did you do that? I have spider sense, with it, I can sense and dodge any threat directed at. Peter couldn't complete the sentence because Thor had thrown his hammer once again, but Peter easily dodged it. Seriously, Thor. Spider-Man says, looking at Thor. Great reflexes. Steve praises Peter. Thanks. Like I said, I need to go. Peter says, preparing to jump out of the broken window. Chapter 9, A New Member. Peter was so deep in his own thoughts that he didn't even notice Natasha sneaking up behind him with a gun pointed at his back. If I were you, I'd take off the mask. Otherwise, I won't hesitate to pull the trigger. And I'm pretty sure, given the short distance between us, you won't have time or space to dodge the bullet. Natasha says with a serious tone, threatening Spider-Man. Peter feels a lump in his throat as he realizes he failed to detect Black Widow's presence with his spider sense. With no other option, he reluctantly follows Natasha's orders. All right, you win. Peter says, removing his mask and raising his hands in surrender. I can't believe it. Clint exclaims, wearing a surprised expression. So, it was you. I had my suspicions. Declared Natasha, looking at Peter. Tony, with a puzzled expression on his face, raises his hand in a pause gesture and says. Wait a moment, I'm confused. You're the same kid I cursed at 2 hours ago. Peter responds to Tony's inquiry with a melancholic expression before continuing to walk. Yes, and as I already said, I think my place isn't here. Realizing that the young man is distancing himself and about to jump from the building, Steve, in an authoritative tone, interrupts Peter. Kid, wait up. Hearing Steve call his name, Peter decides to turn around and face the captain. He was curious about what the leader of the Avengers wanted to talk to him about. You can stay. Steve says, looking at Peter. Well, it's just that. Peter's words are abruptly cut off when Stark interrupts him. Do you have something more important to do? Iron Man asks, looking at Peter. I need to take care of my aunt, who's alone. Peter explains, trying to avoid further questions. If you want, we can figure that out. Natasha says calmly, looking at Peter. Now, can you stay? All right, I'll stay. Peter responds, looking at Steve. Clint, who was a little distant from the conversation, observes Tony from afar. He notices Tony's slightly open mouth, wearing an expression he can't quite decipher. Intrigued by the scene, Clint decides to approach Tony. Tony, you'd better close that mouth, so no flies get in. Clint teases his friend, who seems somewhat bewildered by all the events. In Sokovia. At the same time. Inside an underground Hydra base. After being destroyed and managing to escape through the internet, Ultron awakens in a new body. He stands up and begins to examine the other bodies around him, which he could inhabit if destroyed, and declares. Now we can begin our plan, the extinction of the Avengers. Later. 8 p.m. In the main room. The Avengers, along with Peter, were gathered around a table, looking at Ultron's carcass, or what was left of it, a jumble of twisted metal and burnt circuits. Present were Tony, Iron Man, who was examining the robot's remains. Meanwhile, Natasha, Black Widow, and Steve, Captain America, watched Tony study Ultron's body. All our work was in vain. Bruce said, running his hand through his hair in frustration before continuing. Ultron managed to use the internet to escape. Ultron. Steve declared with a serious face. He was in contact with everything, files, cameras. Nat said, pausing briefly before continuing. He probably knows more about us than we know about each other. And if he decides to access something a bit more interesting. War Machine said, holding his injured arm from the fall. For example, nuclear codes. Maria Hill asked, seated in a chair. That, we need to make some calls, if we still can. Rode confirmed while looking at everyone in the room. Will he go after bombs? He wanted us dead. Natasha asked from the other side of the room. That's not what he said extinct. Steve replied, looking aside. But he also mentioned that he had killed someone. Clint said from upstairs. Before getting here, I did a check, and there was no one else in the building. Peter intervened in the conversation before continuing. Unless the building has some kind of self-defense mechanism. When Peter uttered those words, Tony, with wide eyes and raised eyebrows, turned to look at him. An expression of pure surprise spread across his face. He couldn't believe that this kid had such keen insight, enough to be so intelligent. The kid's right, there was someone else inside the building. Tony said as he walked towards the center of the room. In the center of the room where everyone was gathered, Tony, with a simple hand gesture, activated a hologram. What appeared before them was a three-dimensional representation of a brain, glowing in shades of orange. However, it wasn't a perfect image. The holographic brain seemed to have been damaged, with some parts of it looking shattered and fragmented, as if it had suffered severe trauma. But, this is madness, Bruce said, perplexed by the image before him. It makes sense. Since Jarvis was the first line of defense, he tried to stop Ultron. However, he couldn't. Steve said with a pensive expression. But, Captain, that doesn't make sense, Bruce argued, pacing restlessly back and forth before continuing. Ultron could have easily absorbed Jarvis. This isn't strategy, it's hatred. The conversation was abruptly interrupted when Thor, dressed in his uniform, appeared in the room. With an angry look and an imposing presence, he moved quickly towards Stark. Before anyone could react, Thor reached out and grabbed Stark by the neck, lifting him in the air with surprising strength. And it seems to be spreading, Peter said, looking at the scene. Chapter 10, Meeting. Tony, with some difficulty, manages to say, "Please, speak using words, buddy." Stark, I can define you using much more than just words, Thor said, squeezing Tony's neck with a furious look. Thor, what about Ultron? Steve asked as he approached Thor. Upon hearing Steve call his name, Thor looked at him almost instantly. And with a quick and precise movement, he released Stark, who fell violently to the ground. He lay there for a moment, gasping as he tried to catch his breath. He escaped my grasp after 150 kilometers to the north, and what's worse, he has the core now. And once again, we'll have to retrieve it, Thor said, casting an angry look at Tony, who was still on the ground. Our new enemy can move freely through the internet, Natasha said, getting up from a chair and pausing before continuing. And to make our situation worse, he's free. And his name is Ultron. I can't understand, Peter said, drawing everyone's attention to him. He paused before continuing. Was it you who created this program, Mr. Stark? Were you trying to kill all of us? Upon hearing Peter's words, Tony Stark began to walk slowly toward a computer. In that place, Bruce was standing facing everyone. Tony, with an ironic smile on his face, began to laugh softly, finding the situation amusing. Do you find this situation funny, Stark? Thor said, approaching Tony but being stopped by Steve. Of course, it's not funny, right? This is terrible, a complete disaster, Tony said sarcastically. His tone of voice was laden with irony, and he struggled to contain his laughter. This could have been avoided if you hadn't toyed with something, Thor said, looking in Tony's direction but being interrupted by him. You know what's even funnier? Tony said as he approached Thor before continuing. You guys not understanding why we need this. Tony was in the middle of an argument with Thor when Bruce, another member of the group, decided to intervene in the conversation and express his concerns about what Tony was saying. Tony, maybe this isn't the right time. Are you serious, Bruce? Tony questioned, turning to focus all his attention on Bruce. He then continued. Every time someone comes yelling at you, are you going to lower your head and wag your tail like a dog? Only when I end up creating a killer robot, Bruce said ironically, looking at Tony. We didn't create it, not even close, Tony said frankly. Upon hearing those words, Bruce stared at Tony, incredulous at what he had just heard, and replied. No, Tony, we did create it, it just didn't turn out the way we wanted. I know, we made some mistakes in our calculations, Tony said, looking at Bruce, and continued. But were we close to developing an interface? No, we were far from it. Something you managed to do right, and very well, especially here. However, the Avengers should be very different from S.H.I.E.L.D., Steve said as he slowly moved away from the sturdy wooden table. He began to walk with firm and determined steps toward Tony, who was on the other side of the room. His look was serious and determined as he continued. We, as the Avengers, don't manufacture weapons of destruction, we eliminate them. And we are not initiators of wars, we are those who end them. Our mission is to bring peace and security, not conflict and destruction. Has anyone forgotten that I had to carry a nuclear bomb into a wormhole? Tony questioned, with a serious and piercing look, as his eyes scanned each face present in the room. No, nobody talks about that, War Machine said, standing next to Agent Hill. I saved New York, Tony added. Nor that either, Rhodes said, looking at Tony. You remember, a hostile alien army invaded through a hole in space, and we were 100 meters below. Tony said, taking a brief pause before continuing. We are the Avengers, we can deal with arms dealers all day long, but, up there, it would have wiped out everything, and how would we have put an end to that? We would have done it together. Steve replied to Tony's question and continued. We would have lost together. Tony approached Steve, saying. If we had to lose, we'd lose together. Steve, with the help of the other Avengers, and now with a clearer plan in mind and the assistance of Peter Parker, began to prepare to face Ultron. Tony, who was a bit more distant, looked at everyone gathered. Despite differences of opinion and the tension in the air, he knew they needed to work together if they wanted to defeat Ultron. So, what's the next step? Natasha asked, looking at Steve. Steve picked up a folder from the table and opened it, revealing a series of information and plans. First, we need to track Ultron's activity on the internet. He could be hiding anywhere, but let's start where he was last seen. As Steve explained the plan in detail, Bruce Banner looked at Tony with a worried look. Tony, do you have any ideas on how we can neutralize Ultron? You created him, you know his weaknesses. Tony sighed, recalling the mistakes he made in creating Ultron. I know I made a mistake, but I don't have a specific plan to shut him down. Ultron is smart, he has become autonomous. We need to be careful. Steve nodded and looked at Peter. Do you have any special skills that could be useful on this mission? Steve asked. Peter nodded in response to Steve's question. Well, in addition to my spider abilities, I'm also good with technology. I can help track Ultron online and maybe find a clue that leads us to him. So, that's our plan. Steve declared, leaning slightly forward, making eye contact with each member of the team present. Chapter 11, Getting to Know Ultron. In Sokovia. At the same time. 2 hours later. As Wanda and her brother Pietro were walking through the devastated streets of Sokovia, something unexpected happened. Wanda felt a strange sensation, as if a wave of dark energy had invaded her body, causing her to stop abruptly. Her heart began to beat faster, and a shiver ran down her spine. Did something happen, Wanda? Pietro asked, concerned for his sister. I feel a bad energy coming from that church. Wanda said, pointing her finger at the church in front of her. But that church has been abandoned for many years. No one has entered it since we were children. Pietro said, looking at a completely destroyed building. Wanda looked at her brother and spoke. I can't explain it, but it seems like there's someone inside. She then suggested. Maybe we should go take a look. Recognizing his sister's curiosity, Pietro chose to accompany her to confirm if there really was someone inside. Let's go. Pietro said. As they approached the entrance of the church, Pietro noticed that his sister was holding a photo. Intrigued, he asked. Why are you holding his photo? Pietro pointed at the picture. Well, considering that he's the only hero who didn't join the Avengers. I thought maybe he could help us. Wanda said, trying to hide her curiosity about Spider-Man. Well, if you say so. But that's strange. Pietro muttered, taking a pause before continuing. Why would anyone come here? This church has been abandoned for years. As they entered the church, they noticed the presence of someone sitting in a chair in the dark. Wanda approached the individual next to her brother and spoke. So, it was you emitting that negative energy? Wanda inquired with a serious tone. Did you know that this church is right in the center of the city? Said the unknown person, still sitting in a wooden chair, with only his arm visible, before continuing. Priest's requirement so that everyone would be equally close to God. I like that geometry of belief. Observing that Wanda was trying, unsuccessfully, to read his mind, the stranger said. You must be wondering why you can't read my mind. Sometimes it's not so easy. Sooner or later, all men reveal themselves as they truly are. Wanda retorted. As soon as Wanda spoke, the stranger stood up, revealing himself as Ultron. The robot that Stark had created, but now he was in a new body. Upon seeing who the stranger was, Wanda and Pietro backed away. Yes, most change. Ultron said as he approached the siblings, before continuing. But you needed more than just a simple man, so you allowed Stark to take the scepter. I didn't expect. Wanda said, pausing briefly before continuing. However, I saw fear in Stark's eyes. I realized that fear would consume him, leading him to self-destruct. Humans always create what they fear. Ultron said as he began to walk, before continuing. Men of peace create weapons of war, invaders form Avengers, humans create. Oh, smaller beings, children. I forgot the word for a moment. Yes, children, created to succeed them, to lead them to their ultimate destiny. So, is that what you were created for? Pietro asked while looking at Ultron, and his sister added. Did you come to destroy the Avengers? I was created to save the world, but also. I'm here to destroy them. Ultron said, turning in Wanda's direction. Back at Avengers Tower. 30 minutes later. 10:30 p.m. Peter was at the top of the room, sitting on a couch that had been occupied by Clint just a few minutes ago. He could hear the chatter of the other team members gathering downstairs. He held his phone in his hand while calling his aunt. Hello, Aunt May. Peter said, getting up from the couch and moving to a quieter place. Peter, where are you? His aunt asked from the other end of the line, with a tone of evident concern in her voice. I'm still here at Mr. Stark's tower, Aunt. Peter replied, trying to reassure his aunt. But I heard the party is over. Aunt May questioned her nephew. Well, I received an internship offer from Stark Industries, and my first day starts tomorrow. Peter declared, trying to persuade his aunt. Peter, you're not lying, are you? May asked from the other end of the line. No way, Aunt May. When have I ever lied to you? Peter responded as he paced back and forth. However, May was not willing to easily accept Peter's story. She knew how skilled her nephew was at creating excuses to hide things. Peter, you know very well how important it is for me to know the truth. I don't want you getting into trouble. May insisted firmly. Peter sighed and looked around the room, searching for Tony Stark, who was in the midst of a meeting with other Avengers members. He was caught in a dilemma, whether to tell his aunt the truth and risk revealing his secret identity as Spider-Man or try to find a way to calm her concerns without involving Tony Stark. I need to be sure this is true, pass the phone to Tony Stark. May said, somewhat suspicious of everything her nephew had said. But, Aunt, he's in a very important meeting right now. Peter said, trying to change the subject. Natasha, in her Avengers uniform, appeared on the upper floor where Peter was talking to his aunt on the phone. Any issues with your aunt? Natasha asked, with a serious but understanding expression. Peter sighed, concerned about the situation. Yes, she's somewhat suspicious about me receiving the internship offer from Stark Industries. She wants to talk to Mr. Stark, but Tony is busy at the moment. Natasha nodded. I understand her concern, but I can talk to her and confirm that it's all true. She would trust one of the Avengers, right? Peter reluctantly agreed, feeling relieved. Yes, I'm sure she would trust you. Chapter 12, Confidence. Natasha took the phone from Peter's hand and began to talk to May. Good evening, Mrs. Parker. Said Natasha, changing her tone of voice. Good evening, who am I speaking to? May asked, her voice somewhat concerned by the sudden switch. This is Natasha Romanoff, also known as Black Widow. I'm here with Peter at the Avengers Tower, and I can assure you that everything he said is true. He really received an internship invitation from Stark Industries, and his first day is tomorrow. Natasha tried to maintain a calm and reassuring tone. While explaining the situation to May. May hesitated for a moment, but Natasha's confident voice reassured her. I see, but what about his things? Later, I'll ask Stark's driver to pick up his things from there. Don't worry. Natasha said calmly and serenely. Thank you for taking care of my nephew. Could you please pass the phone to him? Natasha nodded, even though May couldn't see it, and then handed the phone back to Peter, maintaining the reassuring smile. Peter, your aunt wants to talk to you. Natasha said as she handed over the phone. Peter took the phone and brought it back to his ear. His voice still trembled with nervousness as he said. Aunt May, see, I told you. May sighed with relief on the other end of the line. Peter, as soon as your internship is over, I want you to come straight home. No hanging around in the streets, understood? Peter smiled, feeling a great weight lifted off his shoulders. Aunt May, I promise I'll be careful. May, hearing those words from her nephew, felt her heart calm even more. That's all I ask, my dear. Take care, and remember that I'm here for you no matter what happens. Peter hung up the phone and looked at Natasha with gratitude in his eyes. He was still getting used to the idea of being at the Avengers Tower and having Black Widow as an intermediary in a conversation with his aunt. It was all so surreal. Thank you, Miss Natasha. You just saved my life, Peter said, still smiling. Natasha nodded, placing her hand on Peter's shoulder in a comforting gesture. You're a good kid, Peter. Just so you know, our flight leaves in half an hour, and I count on your presence. If you're not there, you know what will happen. Natasha said with a serious look and a threatening tone. Peter felt a shiver run down his spine at Natasha's subtle threat. He knew Black Widow wasn't joking, but at the same time, he was grateful that she had talked to Aunt May. Don't worry, Miss Natasha, I'll be on that flight on time, Peter replied, still somewhat scared. Natasha nodded in satisfaction, removing her hand from his shoulder. I'm glad to hear that, Peter. Now, go get ready. And just a quick question, did you make this suit yourself? Peter looked down at his homemade Spider-Man costume, feeling a bit embarrassed. He never expected someone like Black Widow to be interested in his suit. Well, actually, I made this suit myself, Peter confessed, scratching his head. It's kind of simple, I know, but it gets the job done. Natasha examined the suit with some curiosity, her trained eyes capturing every detail that most people wouldn't notice. Not bad for an amateur job. You've got talent, kid, Natasha commented as she assessed Peter's suit design. Do you have any plans to improve it or make it more functional? If Mr. Stark helps me, who knows? Peter replied playfully, earning a laugh from Natasha. Considering how stingy Tony can be, I have my doubts, Natasha replied, laughing. You can tell. Peter and Natasha continued their conversation, and then they headed outside the tower, where the sunlight reflected off the Quinjet's metallic surface. With its doors open, the aircraft appeared ready to take off at any moment. With a mutual nod, they boarded it, their footsteps echoing in the empty interior of the vehicle. Once inside, Tony turned to Steve, his eyes meeting those of Natasha and Peter. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice filled with a seriousness rarely seen. Are you really planning to take this kid into our fight against Ultron? Tony said, his tone somewhat agitated. Steve Rogers, Captain America, who was standing next to Tony, intervened with his usual calmness. He knew that Peter had proven his worth and deserved to be there. Tony, you've seen what he can do. He's strong, his reflexes are excellent, and his combat skills are impressive. Plus, he's already faced tough situations before, Steve argued. Tony sighed, running his hand over his face and looking at Natasha, who nodded in agreement with Steve. Peter remained silent, letting the two leaders discuss his role in the mission. All right, you guys know best. What do you think about an apology? Steve asked, looking at Tony. No, absolutely not, I didn't do anything wrong, Tony said with a serious look, glancing at Steve who was beside him. If you say so. Tony and Steve continued to exchange tense looks for a few more seconds before Steve finally broke the silence. Tony, I know our dynamics haven't always been perfect, but we're all here for the same reason, to stop Ultron from causing more destruction. And Peter is a valuable ally, and he deserves our trust, Steve explained with empathy in his voice. The Quinjet cut through the skies, leaving the Avengers Tower behind. The silence inside the aircraft was palpable, each of the occupants immersed in their own thoughts and concerns. Tony Stark was focused on adjusting the Quinjet's weapon systems, while Steve Rogers looked outside, lost in his thoughts about the upcoming battle against Ultron. Chapter 13, Traumas. Somewhere in the old Hydra base. Midnight, Friday. In a dimly lit corridor, the hum of machines echoed through the environment. It was possible to see the machines created by Ultron, an intelligent program developed by Tony and Bruce. The original intent was for Ultron to be a peace project, but it ended up betraying its original principles. Instead, Ultron adopted the idea of eliminating the Avengers and, consequently, humanity. Ultron watched as his robots worked diligently on the carcass of an alien creature. This creature was a Chitauri, one of Thanos' soldiers who had invaded Earth with Loki in the past. Ultron used the remains of the Chitauri to manufacture his own army and create his vibranium armor. We are ready to begin, but there's still something missing to make our plan work, Ultron said as he was joined by Wanda and Pietro. Ultron turned to face the siblings, his eyes glowing with a cold blue light. What we lack is the final piece of the puzzle, the key to our success. We need Loki's scepter. Pietro raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. But didn't we let Stark take the scepter? How are we going to get it back? I have my methods. Ultron replied quickly, an enigmatic smile forming on his metallic lips. Wanda closely observed the robots in front of her and exclaimed with a neutral expression. But they all look identical. I know, they are all me. Ultron said calmly, looking at Wanda before continuing. I have what the Avengers don't have, harmony. I have a unique and cohesive mind, unlike them, who are discordant. Stark is already causing conflicts among them, and when you enter their minds. Ultron tried to continue his explanation, hovering and pulling an iron chain, but was interrupted by Pietro. Pietro approached Ultron, voicing his concerns. We don't want to kill anyone. Ultron, feigning interest, responded. I know what you want, but have patience. Try to see the bigger picture. Wanda tried to interrupt her brother, but he continued, revealing their painful pasts. I don't see a big picture, I see a small photograph. I take it out of my pocket and look at it every day. Ultron showed fake empathy for Pietro's story. I know, I've seen your records, you lost your parents in a bombing in Sokovia. Pietro, with a melancholic expression, continued. Records aren't images. We lived through it, felt it in our bones. Wanda tried to ease the situation. Pietro. But Ultron insisted on hearing the complete story, feigning empathy. No, go on. We were only 10 years old, the four of us were at a family dinner. My sister and I, and our parents. Suddenly, a missile struck our building, 2 floors below where we were. The impact was so strong that it created a crater in the ground. Our parents tried to save us and ended up falling, and then the entire building started collapsing around us. I acted quickly, grabbed my sister, and took her under the bed, in an attempt to find some shelter. While we were there, trying to hide, a second missile hit our building. However, by some miracle, it didn't explode. It stayed there, lodged in the wreckage, just a few meters from our faces. And the strangest thing was that there was a word written on the side of the missile. Pietro paused dramatically, and Wanda added with seriousness. Stark. Pietro continued, reliving the trauma. We were trapped in the rubble for 2 days. With every movement, every attempt to escape, we thought that thing would blow us up. We spent 2 long and agonizing days, waiting for Stark to kill us. Wanda looked at Ultron with anger and hatred in her face. We know the truth about them, and that's why we don't want to become like them. Pietro, trying to calm his sister, added calmly. We don't want to cause more deaths. I kept wondering, why did only you 2 survive Straker's experiments? Now I know, you were special, you and I can hurt them. Ultron said, pointing at Pietro. And you will tear them apart from the inside. Ultron said, looking at Wanda. Wanda, with eyes filled with resentment and pain, stared intensely at Ultron. We don't want to become weapons of destruction, no matter what we've been through. We don't want to cause more suffering. Pietro nodded, reinforcing their decision. We just want justice, not revenge. You have the potential to use your gifts powerfully, not just to hurt us, but to reveal to the world the truth about the Avengers and all those who hide behind their hero masks. The Maximoff siblings were at a crossroads, confronted with the choice to join Ultron or follow their own path in search of justice. However, they knew that this decision wasn't just about themselves, it was about the future of the world and the balance of power in the hands of those who could shape it. While the dark corridor seemed even darker with Ultron's sinister presence, Wanda and Pietro pondered what to do next, aware that their choices would shape the fate of everyone involved. The Maximoff siblings began to realize that, although Ultron could be a threat, he also shared a common enemy, those who had caused so much pain in their lives. It was an opportunity for them to use their powers for a greater purpose, without falling into the abyss of revenge. Chapter 14, Infiltration Plan. Back to the Avengers base. At the same time, Tony was completely focused on the task of locating Ultron. He was surrounded by computer screens, codes, and holograms projecting real-time maps and data. Tony knew that time was crucial, as Ultron was currently posing a threat to everyone. At this moment, Steve Rogers and Maria Hill arrived in the control room of the tower, entering via the elevator. As they ascended the metal stairs leading to the third floor of the base, Steve maintained a serious expression, while Maria Hill carried a tablet containing some information about Ultron's recent activities. "He's all over the world," Agent Hill said, with a serious expression, before continuing her explanation. "We've received reports from people who claim to have witnessed robots entering and leaving robotics laboratories and weapon depots, emptying the locations and disappearing shortly after." Steve looked at Agent Hill, absorbing the gravity of the situation. "Any casualties?" he asked, concerned about the safety of civilians. Maria responded with a calm demeanor that reflected her experience in dealing with such situations. "Only when they tried to stop them. Most were left in a trance, talking about old memories, nightmares from the past, and something so fast they could barely see it." "The Maximoff twins?" Steve inquired as he climbed the stairs. "Yes," Agent Hill replied, also ascending the stairs. "It makes sense for Ultron to go after them, they have something in common." Steve expressed his opinion as he reached the third-floor ground. "They had." Agent Hill, following closely behind, made a brief statement. "They did." She handed Steve a tablet containing a photo of Baron Strucker dead in a cell and a message written in his blood. "Peace." Steve nodded with seriousness, understanding the urgency of the situation. "We need to find Ultron and stop him as soon as possible before he becomes an even greater threat." Upon arriving on the third floor of the base, Steve turned to get Clint's attention. Clint was a bit further away, talking on the phone. "Barton, we have updates," Steve said, calling his friend's attention before continuing. "I have to go," Clint whispered as he hung up the phone. "Who were you talking to?" Steve asked, somewhat curious. "Girlfriend," Clint replied as he approached Steve. 20 minutes later. After everyone gathered in the control room, Steve, with a serious expression, walked toward Thor, who was in the center of the table. He held a tablet in his hands and handed it to the God of Thunder. Thor looked at it confused and asked, "What is this?" Steve, standing next to Thor with crossed arms, spoke with a serious expression. "Ultron killed Strucker and left a message at the crime scene for us." Natasha, who was sitting in a chair, spoke without taking her eyes off the monitor in front of her. "This is becoming a smokescreen. Why would he send us a message right after threatening us?" Natasha turned and directed her gaze at Steve. "Strucker possibly knew something that Ultron wanted to keep from us, so Ultron chose to silence him," Steve said, looking at Natasha. Steve then turned and walked toward Tony, who was busy analyzing some information on a screen. "Tony," Steve asked as he approached him, "have you found any leads on Ultron's whereabouts?" Tony, immersed in his analysis, responded without taking his eyes off the screen. "I think I found something. He's using his own communication network. I'm trying to hack into that network. Once I trace the signal's origin, we can go there to investigate." Salvage Yard. 2:30 p.m., Tuesday. After a month of relentless searching, filled with trial and error, the Avengers finally had a breakthrough. They managed to trace a precise location that led them to a cargo ship anchored at the African coast dock. This ship was no ordinary vessel, it belonged to Ulysses Klaue, a criminal and arms dealer in the black market. During their investigations, they discovered a vital clue: Ultron would likely seek out Ulysses to negotiate the vibranium stock he had stolen from Wakanda. As the team approached the estimated location, Tony, Nat, Bruce, Peter, and Steve gathered in the aircraft's control room to discuss the action plan. As the Avengers aircraft approached the cargo ship, they could see activity on the deck. Armed men guarded the perimeter, and it was evident that Ultron was inside the ship, negotiating with Ulysses Klaue. "We've arrived," Tony announced as he landed the aircraft at a somewhat discreet point on the ship. "Wow, my first mission with the Avengers," Peter said excitedly as he looked out the jet's window. Peter continued to observe the scene with a mix of excitement and nervousness. After all, this was his first real mission with the Avengers, and the responsibility was enormous. As the infiltration group prepared to disembark from the aircraft, Tony gave Peter some final instructions. "Kid, remember what I told you. Stay close to us and follow our orders. And no impulsive moves, got it?" Peter nodded in agreement, understanding the intention behind Tony's words. He was aware of the mission's importance and the danger many people would face if something went wrong. With the infiltration group ready, they quietly disembarked from the Quinjet and began to move through the ship, avoiding initial contact. Steve led the ground support team, preparing to intervene if anything went wrong. Thor watched closely, his hammer ready to be thrown at any moment. Inside the ship, Klaus stood inside a cabin, a serious expression on his face as he watched through binoculars his henchmen tirelessly carrying boxes of weapons and ammunition. Sweat trickled down their faces as they moved the heavy cargo, all destined for a lucrative future sale. However, his attention was abruptly interrupted by the shrill sound of the phone on his desk. Klaus let out a brief sigh, setting aside his binoculars and walking toward the phone. He picked up the phone and answered with a serious voice. "Speak." On the other end of the line, a person responded with a trembling voice. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Klaus." The mercenary listened attentively, his gaze growing increasingly serious as the conversation continued. "I don't care if your men fooled you," Klaus retorted, his voice growing more intense. "I sent you 6 heat trackers. And what do I get? A damn ship full of junk. How about this?" Klaus asked, maintaining a serious tone in his voice. "Either you present me with a good offer, or the next missile I send your way will be so fast you won't even notice when it hits you." Klaus hung up the phone rudely on the desk. Chapter 15, The Confrontation. Right after hanging up the phone, Klaus, with an expression of fury, was overcome by a wave of anger and without thinking twice, he swept his arm across the table, sending everything crashing to the floor with force. Damn it, how did those idiots manage to steal my merchandise?" Klaus muttered, his voice filled with anger and frustration. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to calm himself. At that moment, an electrical malfunction occurred, and everything turned dark. Klaus realized it wasn't a simple power failure but rather someone attempting to infiltrate the ship. With extreme caution, he made his way to his weapon, which had fallen to the ground during his fit of rage. As he picked up the weapon, he saw a shadow dart quickly across his field of vision. He tried to shoot, but something incredibly fast not only dodged the bullet but also snatched the weapon from his hand. "Well, look who we have here, the enhanced ones," Klaus said calmly, looking at Pietro and Wanda. The mesmerizing-eyed girl and her speedster brother. Klaus added ironically, taking a seat before continuing. "Care for a sweet treat?" Klaus remained seated in his chair, observing every move of the enhanced siblings. He knew he was at a disadvantage and was well aware of their abilities, but he tried to maintain his composure. "You two really know how to make a dramatic entrance, don't you?" Klaus taunted, shaking his head. "But let's get straight to the point. What do you want here?" Klaus inquired, looking at the Maximoff siblings. "If you were trying to intimidate me, unfortunately, it didn't work," he added mockingly. "And from what I can see, you two aren't in charge." Klaus continued to stare at the siblings. "And I only speak to the men in charge." At the exact moment Klaus uttered those words, a robotic figure emerged from behind him. This was Ultron, who suddenly appeared, his imposing and dominating presence filling the entire space. With a swift and powerful motion, Ultron extended his hand and shattered the glass behind Klaus. The sound of shattering glass echoed throughout the room, and shards flew in all directions. Without giving Klaus time to react, Ultron grabbed him by the neck and threw him away with surprising strength. Ultron began to walk in the direction Klaus had been thrown. "There is no man in charge," Ultron said seriously, crouching down before continuing. "Shall we talk business with the Avengers?" Meanwhile, inside the ship, Tony, Peter, and Natasha were approaching the area where the meeting was taking place. They could hear Ultron's voice but couldn't hear the conversation clearly as they were still a bit distant. As they got closer, they were able to hear the conversation more clearly. Back to Ultron and Klaus. While Ultron maintained his serious gaze in Klaus's direction, the mercenary began to compose himself slowly. He coughed and, with a discomfort expression, reached for his sore neck. "Business," Klaus said, rising with some difficulty before continuing. But I only sell weapons and ammunition, you probably won't be interested in anything here. Ultron remained impassive, revealing few emotions on his metal face. I don't need those outdated things. Ultron replied, looking at Clow. What I want is the stockpile of vibranium you stole from Wakanda. Ultron said with a subtle smile, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Vibranium, you say? Clow murmured, choosing his words carefully. Well, my friend, you're in luck. I have exactly what you're looking for. Ultron didn't react, just continued to watch Clow closely. Follow me. Clow said, leading Ultron and the Maximoff siblings to a room hiding a secret door. At first glance, upon opening the door, all they saw were barrels containing toxic substances, nothing out of the ordinary. However, when Clow pressed a button, an elevator revealed itself, descending to reveal a room where Ulysses kept his hidden stockpile of vibranium. Using this stone, I will build my church. Ultron said, tossing the container containing the vibranium to Pietro. I obtained this at a high cost, a very high cost. Clow added, running his hand over his neck scar before continuing. This is worth billions. Great, now you're valuable too. Ultron said, hacking into Clow's account and transferring the funds to it. Now they're under your orange property. Ultron continued, looking at Clow and his henchmen. Finances are complicated. But as I like to say, keep your friends and enemies rich, and you'll see who's who. However, after Ultron uttered those words, Clow and his subordinate couldn't help but look at Ultron with surprise. Stark. Clow said, looking at Ultron. What? Ultron said, slowly turning his head in an intriguing manner, his eyes still fixed on Clow, trying to understand what he had said. Tony Stark used to tell me those same words. You and him. Clow continued as he approached Ultron with a serious look on his face. What do you mean? Ultron said, with a serious expression on his face as he grabbed Clow's arm. Do you think I'm one of Stark's puppets? Look at me. Am I Iron Man? Ultron expressed angrily, while, with a swift motion, he severed Clow's arm. Don't compare me to Stark. Stark is a disease. Ultron said, kicking Clow in the face, causing him to tumble down the stairs, completely dazed. Oh, Junior. Tony said, suddenly appearing behind Ultron, surprising him with his unexpected arrival. Turning around, Ultron, who still had Clow's arm in his hand, found himself facing Thor and Captain America. So, you're breaking Daddy's heart. Tony Stark added, with a mix of disappointment and sarcasm in his voice as he observed Ultron. Chapter 16, Provocations. Maybe I want to do this. Ultron said, tossing Clow's bloody arm onto the floor as Wanda and Pietro, who were a bit farther away, approached him. Meanwhile, Clint was positioned on the upper deck of the ship, advancing with extreme caution and attention to every step he took with his bow at the ready. Natasha, on the other hand, was on the opposite side, strategically positioning herself on the deck, remaining alert. Peter, on the other hand, was a bit higher up, near the ship's walls, establishing an elevated position that provided him with an additional tactical advantage over the others. Ultron, with his metallic and sarcastic voice, attempted to provoke the assembled heroes in the room. He was determined to highlight the weaknesses and flaws of each of them. Ah, the glorious Avengers, defenders of humanity, or at least that's what they say. Ultron began, his voice echoing menacingly throughout the room. But let's take a closer look, shall we? Let's start with Captain America. He pointed his metallic finger in the direction of the team leader, Steve Rogers, who stood with an erect posture and his shield in hand. You, Captain America, the man who thinks he's a saint but can't live without a war. So tied to the past, clinging to a time that no longer exists. A man out of his time, lost in modernity. How can you lead when you yourself don't belong in this world? Steve looked at Ultron with a calm face, but the robot knew that his provocation had struck a nerve. He continued his ruthless analysis. Next, Natasha, the deadly spy. Who hides secrets as well as she fights. How much trust can you have in someone who lurks in the shadows? You hide behind masks and lies, but how long can you evade your past? Ultron said, directing his gaze toward where Natasha and Clint were hiding, making a brief pause before continuing. Clint Barton, the archer who seems to have a normal family but always returns to action when called. Will you ever be able to leave this dangerous life behind and find the peace you seek? And Iron Man, Tony Stark. The man who considers himself the genius behind everything but often acts as if he's the only one who knows what's best for the world. You've built your suits and your machines, but have you ever considered the human cost of your inventions? Ultron continued, his red eyes gleaming with disdain. So, all of you, gathered under the name of the Avengers, believe that you're the solution to the world's problems. But I'm here to show you that you are, in fact, part of the problem. Your actions have consequences, and they're not always positive. Ultron slowly moved around the room, looking each one in the eyes, as if challenging them to contest his words. Thor, who stared at Ultron with determination, wasn't shaken by the villain's provocations. No one will break anything here, we can find a way to resolve our differences without resorting to violence. Declared the God of Thunder, making it clear that he was willing to solve the situation peacefully. However, Ultron mocked Thor with a sarcastic smile. Sure, you've never made an omelet. You took the words right out of my mouth. Tony quipped. How funny, Mr. Stark, feeling comfortable. Pietro said in an ironic manner as he approached Ultron. Like in the old times. Pietro continued, looking at some missiles that Clow had stolen from Stark Industries, a dark reminder of the past. My life has never been about this. Tony said, pointing toward the bombs, his tone carrying a weight of sadness. Meanwhile, Peter, nearly invisible on the ceiling, observed Pietro and Wanda for the first time. He noticed that the two siblings were also young, just like him. With the decision to interact with them, Peter shot a web to the ground and positioned himself between Thor and Tony. I don't know what you've been through, Peter said empathetically before continuing. But I believe you can still get out of this. Ultron watched Peter with interest, while Wanda and Pietro exchanged glances before turning to the young hero. The tension on the ship's deck was palpable, but Peter maintained his calm and determined posture. You don't know us, kid. You don't know anything about what we've been through, Pietro said challengingly. Peter took a step forward, keeping a steady gaze on the twins, trying to convince them to reconsider their alliance with Ultron. He understood that they had their reasons but was determined to show them that the path they had chosen was fraught with dangers. I know you have your reasons to be on Ultron's side, Peter began. But believe me, he's not the solution. He'll only bring more destruction and pain. Wanda seemed intrigued by Peter's words, and her powers began to spark erratically. Ultron, realizing that the twins were wavering in their decision, decided to seize this opportunity to advance and try to convince them to remain on his side. He used his powers to create an illusion, showing them a distorted vision of a supposedly perfect world under his rule. You can have everything you desire, everything that was taken from you in the past, Ultron said, his hypnotic voice echoing in the twins' minds. This is the future I can offer you. Join me, and we'll end the pain and loss. Steve, seeing that the twins were swaying in their decision, tried to intervene and change the course of the situation. Don't listen to him, Steve said, his expression serious. I know you've been through hardships. Thor, on the other hand, couldn't contain his anger at the situation. Ultron. Thor thundered menacingly, his voice echoing like thunder before continuing with a calmer yet imposing tone. If you truly believe in peace, then let us keep it. Ultron responded with a touch of irony in his voice. My dear friend, I think you're confusing peace with silence, Ultron said, looking at Thor challengingly. Thor stared at Ultron and was about to respond when a cutting voice interrupted him. Ahem, if you have no ulterior motives, then why do you want the vibranium? The voice belonged to Tony, who had momentarily stepped back during the conversation but now returned with a direct question, pointing at Ultron with a hint of sarcasm. Chapter 17, Time for Twists and Turns. Ultron smiled, looking directly into Stark's eyes, and provocatively said. That's good you asked me, Ultron said with an ironic smile on his face. Because I really wanted this time to explain my evil plan. Ultron continued while making a hand gesture that began to glow in a blue hue. Immediately after, Ultron fired a beam in the direction of the heroes. Peter, with his spider sense, easily managed to dodge it. However, Tony was not as lucky and was hit directly by the beam, which pulled him in Ultron's direction. Stark seized the situation to launch himself towards Ultron, and the two started fighting in the air. At that moment, with a simple hand gesture, Ultron summoned a swarm of robots that appeared in droves, like a tide of metal invading the ship. Thor, the god of thunder, raised his hammer Mjolnir, ready to face the approaching robots. He threw the hammer with force, hitting the robots and knocking them down shortly after. The battle between Tony and Ultron in the air was getting increasingly difficult. The two fought fiercely, exchanging punches and firing energy blasts at each other. The environment was filling up with debris and sparks. Returning to Steve, who raised his shield and threw it towards the robots. He blocked the robots' attacks and, at the same time, counterattacked with great skill. While Thor and Steve fought against the horde of robots, the other heroes joined forces to face the threat. Natasha fought a robot on the upper deck, while Clint shot his arrows in the direction where the robots were emerging, simultaneously helping his teammates. They covered each other while neutralizing the robots with their combat skills and precise aim. "Ah, this must be a joke," Peter said with an indifferent expression behind his mask as he looked at the robots invading the ship. As the battle unfolded intensely, a gray beam of light suddenly appeared out of nowhere and hit Thor, who was in the midst of destroying a robot. In another part of the battlefield, Steve tried to advance against Wanda. However, with a quick and precise movement of her hands, she unleashed a burst of her magic. The force of the magic was so intense that it sent Steve flying. At the bottom of the ship, where Clow had fallen, he rose with a furious expression and impatient gestures as salt water dripped from his clothing. He turned to one of his henchmen, a hulking figure covered in tattoos and scars, and growled. "Come on, shoot them," Clow said, still struggling due to the pain of his arm being cut by Ultron. "But who, boss?" said the tattooed and scarred henchman. "Everyone," Clow shouted angrily. After Clow said those words with a furious grin on his face, his henchman quickly rose and went to the other thugs who were hiding behind crates and barrels. He signaled for them to prepare to attack while grabbing a machine gun hanging from his shoulder. The boss said to shoot everybody. The tattooed henchman shouted at the other thugs. The thugs nodded in response. After the arrival of the criminals on the ship's deck, the environment turned chaotic. The heavily armed thugs began firing in all directions, turning the place into a war zone. However, Natasha, with her cunning and skill, managed to dodge the shots. She moved with agility, disappearing and reappearing in the shadows, and with each reappearance, another thug fell unconscious. Meanwhile, Clint wasted no time. With his remarkable archery skills, he shot his arrows with impressive speed. Each arrow was launched with deadly accuracy, finding its mark among Clow's thugs. With each arrow fired, a thug fell, reducing the enemy's forces. As for Steve and Wanda, Captain America tried to approach the sorceress but ended up being thrown away by her magic. To make matters worse for Steve, Pietro appeared to help his sister. He appeared so quickly that time seemed to stand still around him, and he took advantage of the opportunity to punch Steve in the face, knocking him to the ground. Seeing this, Peter had an idea. "Thor, the hammer," Peter said, who was on the other side of the deck, drawing Thor's attention with a simple hand gesture. Understanding what Peter meant, Thor acted quickly. He hurled the hammer Mjolnir in Pietro's direction, who, upon seeing the hammer passing slowly in front of him, had the incredible idea of trying to grab it. But when he grabbed it, he was also thrown away. The battle between Stark and Ultron intensified to the point where they ended up outside the ship. On the other side of the deck, Steve and Peter had just destroyed all the remaining robots, and with Thor's help, Peter had managed to defeat Pietro. "Stay put, Speedy," Peter said before launching a quick attack that made Pietro faint, temporarily removing him from the fight. He acted swiftly to prevent the brother from further interfering in the situation. Ultron, realizing that his main plan wasn't going as smoothly as planned, turned to a destroyed robot near Wanda. With a sinister tone, he said, "Wanda, it's time to play some mind games." After hearing those words from the robot possessed by Ultron, Wanda nodded and left the deck, heading outside the ship, where Bruce was waiting anxiously inside a ship, just waiting for the signal to turn green. Ultron was determined to carry out his evil plan, even in the face of setbacks. While the battle on the ship's deck was reaching a momentary truce with Pietro and the defeated robots, Ultron focused on his next moves. Wanda, following Ultron's orders, left the deck and headed outside the ship, where Bruce Banner was waiting in a ship. The scientist appeared visibly apprehensive. Meanwhile, Stark and Ultron continued their battle in the air, exchanging blows and firing energy blasts at each other, creating an increasingly chaotic and destructive environment around the ship. Sparks flew, and debris fell into the sea. Chapter 18, Peter vs. Wanda and Pietro. Already inside the ship, Wanda was heading towards Bruce to fulfill Ultron's request, but upon encountering Thor on her way, she reached out to him, using her mental powers to try to manipulate his mind. Thor, typically resistant to mental influences, felt his mind being invaded by Wanda's magic. His hammer, Mjolnir, fell to the ground, and he began to stagger, clearly under the control of the Scarlet Witch. Meanwhile, inside the ship, Bruce was anxiously awaiting orders. He knew that something very bad was happening outside the ship, but he didn't have a clear view of what it was. He was prepared to act at any moment, he just needed the signal that it was safe to go out. While Thor struggled to resist Wanda's mental control, Steve Rogers, Captain America, was recovering from Pietro's attack and preparing to face the Maximoff siblings again. He raised his shield and approached Pietro, who was lying on the ground after Peter Parker's attack. Steve knew he had to neutralize the two as quickly as possible. With a quick gesture, Steve activated the communicator in his ear, trying to establish communication with Thor. "Thor, how's the situation on your end?" Steve asked, with some effort due to the recent fight with Pietro. The God of Thunder responded with a touch of arrogance and confidence in his voice. "The girl tried to manipulate my mind, but as I am stronger than her spell, I managed to resist. I doubt you mere humans could do the same. Be careful." But after saying those words, Thor found himself in a place he knew all too well, Asgard. There he was surrounded by a familiar environment, with parties and orgies happening all day. Confused and alarmed, Thor tried to understand what was happening. It seemed that Wanda's powers had transported him into a disturbing illusion. He looked around and saw his Asgardian friends involved in behaviors he knew well. Thor tried to focus on his Mjolnir, which was on the ground where he had been controlled by Wanda, but the illusion was too powerful. He couldn't lift his hammer and felt powerless against the Scarlet Witch's magic. After regaining consciousness, Pietro observed the situation with a smile on his face. Seeing that his sister's strategy was working on Thor, he decided to help her do the same with the other Avengers. First, he knocked down Steve, and then his sister manipulated his mind. Then the two Maximoff siblings approached Natasha, who was fighting a robot with agility and skill. She didn't notice their presence until it was too late. Wanda reached out to Natasha and began using her mental powers to control the Black Widow's mind. Natasha's eyes became glazed, and her expression changed, now under the control of the Scarlet Witch. Meanwhile, on the other side of the deck, Peter Parker was facing and defeating several robots with his agility and webs. He easily pinned them to the ship's walls, demonstrating his incredible dexterity. However, one of the robots managed to hit him in the face, throwing him off balance for a moment. "Seriously, Spider Sense. You only work when it suits you," Peter said sarcastically, rubbing his face where he was hit. "This won't end like this, your old tin can," Peter continued, pointing to the robot with a serious expression behind his mask. Inside the ship, the situation was getting worse. Wanda and her brother Pietro were using their abilities to manipulate the minds of the Avengers, incapacitating them so they couldn't do anything. Tony, on the other hand, continued his fight against Ultron, but the robot proved to be incredibly strong and resistant, dodging Tony's attacks and striking with increasing force. Tony, concerned, exclaimed, "Jarvis, we have to figure this out. I'm running out of energy here." The AI in Tony's suit replied, "I'm doing my best, Mr. Stark, but he seems to have an endless source of energy. We're in a tight spot." Meanwhile, with his incredible agility, Peter quickly approached the fallen robot. The android tried to shoot him, but thanks to his spider sense, Peter dodged the shots with agility and tore a piece of metal from the ship. With sharp reflexes and exceptional agility, he pierced the robot's chest, causing it to fall apart in a heap of scrap. "Easy peasy," Peter said with confidence before continuing. These robots didn't stand a chance. He continued with a changed expression when he attempted to shoot a web at the wall, but the web shooter failed. "Great, now everything just got better." Peter then took a spare web cartridge from his belt and replaced it right there. Wanda, realizing Peter's momentary distraction, approached him stealthily, extending her hand toward the young hero. Her eyes began to glow with the intensity of her mental powers, ready to enter Peter Parker's mind. Let's see what you fear the most, Spider-Man. Wanda thought as she moved her hands toward Peter. However, as soon as she reached out to him, his spider sense alerted him to the imminent danger. He jumped backward and shot a web that ensnared Wanda's hands. Surprised by the agility and reflexes of the young hero, Wanda was caught off guard by the web that bound her hands. She attempted to use her mental powers to manipulate Peter's mind, but it was in vain. "Your mind games won't work on me, kitty," Peter said confidently, pointing at Wanda. "My spider sense will always alert me when you try something that could harm me." He continued approaching Wanda but was stopped by Pietro, who punched our hero in the face. "What a day, everyone's taking shots at me. This spider sense isn't helping," Peter thought as he got up and saw Pietro picking up Wanda and leaving. But not before our hero threw something at him. "You better run," Peter whispered, still in pain. "Everyone's giving me a hard time today," Peter thought as he walked toward the lower part of the ship where Thor was still trapped in Wanda's illusion. Chapter 19, Reflection. After a while of walking, Peter finds Thor standing, staring into nothing. He then approaches the god of thunder and tries to wake him up, shaking him and calling his name, but it all ends up in vain. "Thor, you need to wake up. This isn't real, it's an illusion," Peter exclaimed, determined to bring Thor back to reality. Realizing that everything he had done had no effect on Thor, Peter decided to seek help from the Avengers. "Hello, anyone there?" Peter says with a communicator in his ear. After a few seconds of tense waiting, a familiar voice responds on the communicator. "You can talk, this is Clint." "What's going on?" said Clint from the other end of the line. "Hey, Hawkeye, how's it going?" Peter asked, almost forgetting the main focus. "Everything's fine here, how about your side?" Clint replied. "It's a bit complicated here. The witch tried to invade my mind, but with my spider sense, she couldn't get anything. Unfortunately, she got Thor," Peter said, turning his head to look at Thor. "I think I might need something similar," Clint said, laughing on the other end of the line. Meanwhile, outside the ship, Tony Stark was still immersed in an epic battle against the villain Ultron. The confrontation unfolded in the midst of the sky. After hours of relentless combat, Tony was getting exhausted but didn't give up. The exchanges of blows were frenetic, with energy blasts, powerful punches, and deafening crashes echoing through the sky. The sound of metal colliding reverberated throughout the area, creating a symphony of destruction. After much effort and an intense battle, Tony finally managed to bring Ultron down and disarm him. "Give up, you can't escape," Tony said, pointing his missile launchers at Ultron. "First of all, I'm not even here anymore, this body is just another shell," Ultron said, looking at Tony calmly. "And second, how are you going to stop me when you'll be busy dealing with Dr. Banner?" Ultron continued, with a mocking smile, as he pointed at the robots carrying the vibranium stock. Upon hearing this, Tony looked at Ultron with a face full of anger and without hesitation, fired a projectile that destroyed Ultron and headed in the direction where Banner or the Hulk might be. He had a new problem to solve. Back with Peter, he went to where everyone was lying on the ground. Natasha dreamt of her training and tortures suffered to become a Black Widow, and Steve of the dance he never got to have with Agent Carter. "Damn, what do I do now?" Peter whispered with a somewhat worried expression. "Go after them, kid," Clint said as he put Natasha's arm over his shoulder. "Are you sure?" Peter asked, looking at Clint. "I am, you can leave them to me, I'll handle it," Clint replied, gently tapping Natasha's face in hopes of waking her up. Peter looked at Clint and, with a subtle nod of approval, walked away. "Thanks." Some time later, Peter had just arrived outside the ship, where he found the Maximoff siblings. Wanda was sitting on a rock while her brother stood in front of her, trying to remove the webbing stuck to his hands. Peter approached the Maximoff siblings cautiously and spoke. "You can try as much as you want, but this webbing won't come off so easily." Upon hearing that voice, Pietro turned, preparing to fight. "It takes, at most, an hour to dissolve," Peter said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight." Wanda, still suspicious, looked at the young hero and asked. "Then what do you want?" "I want to get you out of this path," Peter said, looking at Pietro and Wanda. "Why would you do that?" You don't even know us. Pietro said without lowering his guard. Because I'm just like you. Peter said, removing his mask and showing the siblings that he was also young like them. After revealing himself to the Maximoff siblings, Peter continued to hold his hands up slightly, showing that he didn't pose a threat. Wanda and Pietro exchanged looks of surprise and confusion upon seeing that he was young like them. So, you're the... Wanda started to ask with a curious look but was interrupted by Peter. Yes, I'm Spider-Man. Strange, isn't it? Peter said, somewhat embarrassed, while letting out a brief laugh. Pietro, still trying to remove the webbing from his sister's hands, asked with a tone of distrust. I thought you were older. No, I'm only 17 years old, and I haven't finished high school yet. Peter said, looking at the Maximoff siblings before continuing. In fact, I wanted to tell you that there's still time for you to change sides. No, not until Tony Stark pays for everything he did to us. Pietro said, with a face full of hatred. Peter took a deep breath before replying. I understand that you've suffered, but I want you to understand that seeking revenge isn't the solution to change the world. You can see the damage that Ultron is causing, and he's not the ally you imagine. If you continue on this path, the situation will only get worse. I also grew up without my parents and was raised by my aunt and uncle. Unfortunately, my Uncle Ben lost his life on the same day I gained these powers, Peter added, with a sad expression, remembering his uncle. I know what I'm talking about. At some point, I stopped holding back my anger, I became bitter. It took a long time for me to overcome that darkness. But I did, and believe me, if I could do it, you can too. So why are you on their side? Wanda said, raising her voice a little. Peter looked into Wanda's eyes, understanding the intensity of her emotions. He knew he needed to explain himself properly so that the Maximoff brothers would understand his position. I'd actually been kicked out, but they convinced me to come back and I ended up staying. I have a motto, sometimes it's good to think of others before you think of yourself. Chapter 20, The Hulk's Lack of Control. Are you telling us to abandon our revenge and let Tony Stark escape unpunished? Pietro said, looking at Peter with a less hostile but still skeptical expression. Peter shook his head, maintaining a calm tone in his voice. I'm not saying to forget what happened. I'm saying you can use your powers to make a difference in a way that helps people, without becoming villains. I know pain and anger can be powerful, but so can redemption. Upon hearing those words, both Wanda and Pietro looked at each other. We all have choices, and that's what sets us apart from the villains we face. Revenge only perpetuates the cycle of destruction. But I can help you, if you want. Peter said, crouching down and becoming the same size as Wanda. Let me take this off for you. He said, dissolving the web fluid that was on Wanda's hands. See. Peter continued, still crouched and looking at Wanda's face. Much better than waiting an hour for it to dissolve, right? He added with a slight chuckle. Upon seeing that smile, Wanda couldn't help but give a faint smile as well, and she kept staring at Peter's face, somehow finding it very captivating. Peter slowly stood up and looked Wanda in the eyes before continuing. By the way, what's your name? Wanda stared at him and replied with a gentle voice. Wanda Maximoff, and yours? Peter P. But before he could finish, Peter was interrupted by a powerful punch to the face from Pietro, sending him flying. Pietro, why did you do that? Wanda asked in concern, looking back to see Peter lying on the ground. It doesn't matter now. Let's go. Do you remember our mission? Pietro said, making a brief pause before continuing. The big guy. All right. Wanda replied, still looking shaken. After getting confirmation from his sister, Pietro picked her up and carried her to the Quinjet, which was opening at that moment. When the aircraft opened fully, they saw Bruce inside, looking concerned. Noticing his sister's hesitation, Pietro tried to encourage her with words. Come on, Wanda, just with this, they will understand what we've been through. Okay. Wanda said, still hesitating, and she headed toward Bruce, who was too preoccupied to notice their presence. Wanda cautiously approached Bruce and began manipulating his mind, causing him to turn into the Hulk. The transformation was almost instantaneous. Bruce's skin changed color to a shade of green, his muscles expanded, tearing his clothes, and his eyes gleamed with wild fury. He had become the Hulk. Without wasting any time, the Hulk ran off at astonishing speed, leaving behind a cloud of dust. His destination: the nearest city. The successful transformation had been accomplished, but the consequences of this action were yet to be seen. "We did it," Pietro said, looking at his sister. "Yeah," Wanda replied, still feeling somewhat down. Wanda looked back to see Peter slowly getting up from the ground. Almost automatically, he crouched down and picked up his mask, which had been knocked aside by Pietro's punch. He put it back on, then looked at the two siblings and, immediately after, at the completely uncontrolled Hulk causing destruction on his way to the city. "Do you realize what you've just done?" Peter asked with a trembling voice, his concern evident as he gazed at the devastation caused by the uncontrollable Hulk approaching the city. Pietro, still skeptical and seemingly indifferent to the consequences, responded coldly. "We did what was right, and as Ultron said, it's easier to destroy you using yourselves. Can you just be quiet for a second, Speedster?" Peter said seriously, as he shot a web into Pietro's mouth. Pietro tried to remove it but couldn't. "Now it's much better with your mouth shut, you're quite the poet," Peter remarked. Seeing this, Wanda became somewhat concerned for her brother. "Pietro. Seriously, it's nothing personal, but I don't want to hear your voice for the next few minutes, okay?" Peter said, looking at Pietro and then starting to walk away. "Where are you going?" Wanda asked, curiously. "Well, what do you mean? Can't you see there's a big green monster heading for a city full of people? Where do you think I'm going?" "I'm going there for a picnic," Peter replied, with a touch of sarcasm and a slightly altered voice. "But he's much stronger than you don't stand a chance against him," Wanda said, looking at Peter with a worried expression before continuing. "So why?" "There's no why, it's what makes me a hero, putting my life on the line to save people," Peter replied, now with a calmer voice. "First, I always carry my motto, if I breathe, it means I haven't fallen yet, so it's still a fair fight," Peter said, looking at Wanda with a determined gaze. "And second, what's it to you? Why would you care?" Peter continued, with a puzzled expression. Well, and why I?" Wanda tried to answer Peter but was interrupted by him. "Never mind, forget it. I've already wasted too much of my time with you two, and don't forget, if you're willing to change, you can come to me, and you'll have my support," Peter said, looking at Wanda and turning to Pietro, who was still trying to remove the web from his mouth. "And you, Speedster, if you're calmer when I come back, maybe I'll take this web off your mouth." Peter walks away and leaves the two of them alone, reflecting on their actions. Determined to avoid an even greater disaster, Peter propels himself forward with his web and launches himself towards a building, swinging himself over the city's skyscrapers. Wanda watches all this and ponders what he said to her about his choices causing even more destruction and death. Peter caught sight of the Hulk in the street, destroying everything in his path. The sight was chaotic, even for someone like Peter, who had faced several villains in the past. But he knew he couldn't hesitate, innocent lives were at stake. Chapter 21, Tony vs Hulk. With a quick and agile movement, Peter lands on the roof of a house and quickly assesses the situation. He knew he didn't have the physical strength to defeat the Hulk, but he could use his intelligence to try to steer the Hulk in another direction. Taking a deep breath, Peter tries to stay calm, knowing the situation was explosive. He approached carefully, maintaining a friendly posture despite the tension he felt. "Easy now, Dr. Banner," Peter says, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Do you remember me? We're friends." Hulk, with his bright green eyes that seemed more like sparks of pure rage, stood there with his imposing and muscular figure, an intimidating presence. The confusion escalated even further when Peter, with a daring expression, dared to call the enraged giant by the name of Bruce, something that many knew was a trigger for the Hulk's anger. His eyes, which had previously seemed to shine in a mysterious and almost wild way, now gleamed with uncontrollable fury. Hulk clenched his massive fists and emitted a guttural growl that made the air tremble. Peter, despite the challenging tone of his voice, was not prepared for Bruce's quick reaction. The ground trembled as the Hulk, with titanic and powerful steps, began to run toward Peter. Each step was a demonstration of pure strength, and the earth yielded under the weight of his charge. I didn't mean that, Hulk," Peter shouted in desperation as he backed away, his eyes widening in terror. But it was too late to retreat now, and the Hulk was in full momentum. With a deafening roar that echoed through the urban landscape, Bruce shouted the dreaded words. Hulk! Smash! But before the Hulk could land a punch on Peter, several mini-missiles struck him. Peter, looking surprised, directed his gaze to the sky, where he saw Stark flying. Mr. Stark. Peter said with a less worried expression. Hey, kid, from what I can see, I think I arrived a little late. Tony said, looking at the scene of destruction that extended across the city, with streets in ruins and cars turned upside down. After being hit by the missiles, the Hulk let out a scream of anger. Seconds later, as the dust settled, both Peter and Tony realized that not only had he not been hurt, but he had become even angrier. Where's Natasha? At times like this, her Nina's song would be a great help. Tony asked Peter. She's down too, just like the rest of the team, leaving only me, you, and Hawkeye. Peter replied as he looked at Tony. Tony remained silent for a few seconds and then said, I'm going to have to call Veronica. And you? Tony said, pointing to Peter before continuing. Protect the civilians, get them to safety. Let me handle the big guy. All right. Peter said, giving a thumbs up. While Tony prepared to face the Hulk, Peter knew that his priority was to ensure the safety of civilians in the area. He looked around and saw panicked people running through the streets, damaged cars, and buildings at risk of collapsing. With agility, he shot his webs and began swinging from building to building, directing people to take shelter in safe places. Amid the evacuation of civilians, Peter noticed something falling from the sky and hitting the city's ground. It was the Hulkbuster. It had the same colors as Tony's armors, but its distinctive feature was its size, much larger than the Hulk himself. This was plausible, as it had been designed with the purpose of being large enough to confront the Hulk. Tony approached the massive armor and entered it. All of you, get away from here, now. Tony said from inside the armor, instructing the police and the people around to move away. Peter continued to guide civilians to move away from the area while the Hulkbuster rose imposingly, and the Hulk turned his attention to Tony inside the armor. Tony knew he couldn't waste time. He began to communicate with the Hulk through the Hulkbuster's loudspeaker system, trying to calm the giant green rage. Can you hear me? That witch is messing with your mind, but remember that you are stronger and smarter than her. You are Bruce Banner. Hulk, with eyes still filled with rage, turned and looked back. His face was contorted in agony, and it seemed he was fighting against the influence that was driving him mad, his veins bulging in his neck. When Tony called him Bruce, the Hulk responded with a furious scream, giving him a look of pure anger. All right, I won't call you weak Hulk anymore. Tony said mockingly, taunting the Hulk and making him even angrier. Tony knew that taunting the Hulk was not the best strategy, but he was trying to divert the attention from the uncontrollable fury to gain time. The green giant lets out a deafening roar and launches a car towards Tony, then lunges forward with full force, slamming his massive fists into the Hulkbuster's armor. The impact was so great that it threw Tony away, but he managed to activate the armor's thrusters, and without wasting any time, he charged at the Hulk, slamming him into the ground. The Hulk, now even more furious, stood up and started tearing chunks of concrete out of the ground, throwing them like projectiles at the Hulkbuster. Tony used the shield built into his armor to protect himself from the attacks, but it was clear that facing the Hulk was an arduous task, even with the powerful Hulkbuster. However, Tony manages to anticipate the Hulk's intentions and acts quickly, punching the green giant in the face and launching a bolt of lightning in his direction. The impact of the bolt knocks him into a truck. Hulk breaks free and immediately jumps on Tony's back, hitting the Hulkbuster's arm with an iron bar. Getting me by surprise from behind, low blow, Dr. Banner. Tony said inside the armor. Chapter 22, Tony and Peter vs. Hulk. Meanwhile, Peter continued to ensure that civilians were safe. He used his webs to create protective barriers, directing people to safe areas and preventing unstable buildings from collapsing on them. Back in the fight, Hulk began to dismantle the Hulkbuster, tearing apart each piece of it. Peter, seeing this, had an idea. He grabbed a car with his webs and launched it in Hulk's direction, causing him to be thrown away. All right, now I definitely have your attention. Focus on me. Peter said, approaching Tony. Veronica, lend a hand here, please. Tony said, calling a structure that was flying in the sky, from which several pieces emerged and went to the armor. They started replacing the damaged pieces of the Hulkbuster's arm. "Kid," Tony said quickly, looking at Peter, as the arm of the armor was being completed. "You can talk." Peter replied with a suspicious look at Tony. "Keep the Hulk busy for a few seconds while I fix my armor's arm," Tony said seriously, looking at Pete. "I knew it, now it's up to me to stop that green thing," Peter said ironically, directing his attention to a pizza truck nearby. Determined to keep the Hulk occupied, Peter swung on his webs toward the pizza truck. He knew he didn't have the Hulk's immense strength, but he relied on his agility and intelligence to face the challenge. Hulk, now very enraged, began to run towards Peter with a deafening roar. Peter, seeing Hulk approaching, lifted the pizza truck and threw it in Bruce's direction. Peter's attack with the pizza truck proved to be effective, momentarily stopping Hulk in his charge. Tony watched in admiration as Peter's strategy worked. However, despite being stunned, the Hulk was not defeated. "That's it, kid," Tony said, watching the scene. After receiving the attack, Bruce managed to free himself. Tony, realizing that Hulk had gotten up and was approaching, fired an energy blast in his direction. As soon as the last piece of the armor arrived, Tony didn't hesitate any longer, and with a powerful crash, the fists of the Hulkbuster and the Hulk collided in an explosion of unimaginable strength. The collision generated a massive shockwave that swept everything in its path, debris flying into the air, and the earth trembling. The force of the impact seemed unbelievable, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to be collapsing. Hulk tried to jump on Tony, but Tony managed to knock him down and hold him. With one hand, he restrained the Hulk, while with the other, he began punching his face continuously. "Time for a nap, big guy. Sleep, sleep, sleep," Tony taunted as he continued to punch Hulk's face. Hulk, even after taking multiple punches to the face, found an opening and managed to grab the Hulkbuster's hand. Tony Stark reacted quickly, locking Hulk's hand into the armor and taking off with him struggling. "Okay, let's take this battle to a safer place, where you don't put civilians' lives at risk," Tony said as he tried to take Hulk out of the city. Hulk, not wanting to cooperate with Tony, ended up pushing them into a building. "Oh, no, not there, big guy," Tony grumbled as the Hulkbuster and the Hulk collided with the building, causing even more devastation. Inside the collapsing building, the battle between Iron Man and the Hulkbuster and the Hulk reached new levels of destruction. Walls were demolished, structures collapsed, and debris flew in all directions. Tony was determined to take Hulk away from the city and prevent further harm to civilians. Outside, Peter watched it all with a concerned look on his face. "Oh, no," Peter said, shooting a web toward the building. Tony began to press Hulk against a wall, but he kept struggling. "Come on, Bruce, help me help you," Tony said as he watched an elevator open up behind him. And to avoid further tragedy, he threw a sleeping pill in Bruce's face, which didn't do much good. To make matters worse, the Hulk propelled himself into the wall and kicked the armor, throwing Tony Stark backwards and causing the elevator behind him to plummet. Tony, realizing that Hulk wouldn't give him a chance to save the people trapped inside the elevator, shouted Peter's name, who was still down there. "Parker. Mark it, spit it out on the ground, I'm on my way," Peter said, looking up. After saying those words, Peter shot his web toward the building and propelled himself upward to reach the top more quickly. As soon as he got up there, he shot a web toward the elevator, holding it. "Let's go, folks. The express has reached its destination. Everyone out," Peter said playfully, trying to ease the near-death atmosphere they had just experienced. The passengers inside the elevator hurriedly descended and ran into the building in search of a safe place. As for Tony, the Hulk had managed to escape, throwing Tony out of the building. Tony, seeing Banner free and no one around, spotted Peter with the elevator and had an idea. "Elevator, Parker," Tony said simply, looking at Peter, who instantly understood the message. Peter lifted the elevator with his webs and threw it on top of the Hulk. "Take this, big green guy, and don't forget, kids, what goes down, comes up," Peter said, turning his head and looking forward. Seeing that the attack had worked, Stark wasted no time and delivered a punch with the thrusters of the armor activated to Hulk's face. Peter landed on the Hulkbuster's shoulder and saw Hulk looking at him with an angry gaze while spitting out a tooth. "My bad," Peter said, seeing Hulk looking at him even more angrily. The fight continued at full throttle as the Hulk, now even more enraged, unleashed a deafening roar and charged at the Hulkbuster with renewed ferocity. Tony stood his ground and activated a shield to protect himself from the Green Giant's powerful blows. Meanwhile, Peter, realizing that the battle was far from over, looked down at his uniform, which was already destroyed and torn, and tried to throw his web, but it failed. Chapter 23, Consequences of the Battle. Great, that's all I needed to make it good. Peter said ironically as he checked his web shooters. Ready, no more webs. Peter continued, disbelieving his bad luck. Meanwhile, Hulk and Stark were still fighting, or almost, as it was Hulk who was beating the armor or crushing the Hulkbuster. Every time Tony tried to punch Bruce, he became even angrier and started destroying the suit, piece by piece. After suffering severe damage, the AI in the suit displayed a warning on the screen indicating that the armor had received too many critical hits. Veronica. Tony said, calling the AI, which launched some pieces for the armor's repair, but Hulk ended up destroying all of them. Is there still time to buy that building? Tony said as he approached a building that was still under construction. Sorry, big guy. Tony said as he dropped Bruce from a height. Without wasting time, Stark activated the suit's thrusters and launched himself at full speed toward Bruce, throwing him into the building and destroying it in the process. Meanwhile, Peter tried to save people who hadn't found a safe place to hide. However, a metal bar fell on him, causing him to faint. About 10 minutes later, the army arrived amidst the wreckage and debris. Hulk rose from the wreckage, but this time he was calmer, having freed himself from Wanda's mind control. He began to look around, seeing the injured people and the massive destruction he had caused. Looking down, he noticed Peter lying unconscious under an iron bar. Hulk removed the iron bar and then turned his attention to the army. But before he could do anything, Tony appeared and punched him in the face, knocking him out. Some time later, inside the ship, Hawkeye, with a lot of effort, managed to free Steve, Natasha, and Thor from Wanda's mind control. After everyone regained consciousness, they met with Stark, Bruce, and a battered Peter. What happened to the kid? Steve asked, still a bit dazed and concerned, looking at Peter with his torn suit and bruises all over his body. Tony Stark took a deep breath before answering, concerned about the boy's condition. He was trying to save people in the midst of that chaos. An iron bar fell on him, and he passed out. But he's very injured. Clint said, looking astonished at the scene. Did you do this to him, Bruce? Natasha asked, looking at Banner. I don't remember. Bruce replied with a worried expression. You don't need to feel guilty. He didn't get hurt facing you, he got hurt trying to save people. He'll be okay, I think. Tony said sincerely, trying to alleviate Bruce's guilt. We'll take him to a safe place as soon as we find one. Tony continued, not knowing exactly where they could go. But that's the problem, we can't go back to the city. So, where do we go? Steve asked. Clint, who had been quiet until now, stood up and said. I know a safe place. Tony looked at him with a curious expression and asked. All right, but where is this place? Trust me, I know a place, and believe me, you'll like it. Clint said, with a little smile. Then let's go to this place. Thor said quickly and seriously. After leaving the ship, they headed for the Quinjet and took off with Clint at the controls. Bruce was sitting in a corner, still shaken by everything he had done, the people he had hurt, and the buildings he had destroyed as the Hulk. Steve and Tony were in the front of the jet, with Clint. Thor looked out the window, and Natasha was tending to Peter's injuries. Peter woke up and looked at her. Where am I? Peter said with some difficulty as he sat up. Nobody kissed me while I was unconscious, right? Peter continued hastily, eliciting laughter from those on the jet due to his innocence. Relax, kid. We're inside the Quinjet, heading to a safe place. Steve said calmly, looking at Peter. Oh, and where's the Hulk? Peter asked, looking around and not finding Bruce. Is that one over there enough? Tony said, pointing to a somewhat shy Bruce in the corner, with a sad expression. Don't worry, the Hulk won't be appearing anytime soon. Natasha said, looking at Peter. Man, I'm hurting all over. Peter said, touching his ribs to check if any were broken. Did anyone get the license plate of the truck that hit me? Peter continued with a pained expression. Watch your language, Steve said, looking at Peter. Sorry, Captain, Peter said, bowing in apology. You were hit by a metal bar while saving people, Tony said, turning his head and looking at Peter. And, as always, this spider sense only works when it wants to. Peter mumbled softly. You can relax now, you're safe, Natasha said, gently patting Peter's hair. Where are we going? Peter asked while still sitting, looking at Steve. Clint is taking us to a shelter, Steve said, pointing to Clint. Yeah, to a shelter far away from here, Clint said with a little smile. Damn, Peter muttered, but was soon interrupted by Natasha. What's wrong? Any problem? Natasha asked, looking at Peter with a worried expression. It's nothing, I just forgot to tell my aunt that I wouldn't be able to come home now, Peter said with a worried expression before continuing. She's going to kill me. We'll figure that out later, Steve said, placing his hand on Peter's shoulder, trying to calm him. All right, Peter said, nodding his head. After the brief conversation inside the Quinjet, the group headed for the shelter suggested by Clint. As they flew, Peter tried to straighten up as best he could, still feeling the pain in his body. He looked out of the window, observing the landscape that passed quickly below them. The worry about how to explain his absence to his aunt continued to bother him. Kid, I've been curious since the day you dodged Thor's hammer and now, you're unaffected by the little witch's mind control. How did you do that? Clint says, a little curious, looking at Peter. Chapter 24, Shelter. Well, I sort of have a sixth sense, which I call spider sense. It doesn't allow any threat to reach me, Peter explained to Clint. Or at least that's what it should do, Peter continued, with a hint of doubt in his head. How cool, Natasha said, with a surprised expression as she looked at Pete. Really? Tony whispered so low that no one heard him. Kid, you're amazing, Steve praised Peter's power. At some point, he's good, but he's no wonder. It doesn't work when I want it to, and sometimes when it does, I don't need it, and when I really need it, it lets me down, Peter said calmly, drawing some laughs from the other team members. A while later, in the Quinjet. After the conclusion of the last battle, a feeling of tiredness and exhaustion began to dominate all the group members. Some had headaches due to Wanda's spells, while others, more specifically Peter and Tony, were exhausted because of the Hulk. The Quinjet flew silently through the sky, taking the heroes to a place Clint assured was safe. The sound of the engines was comforting, almost hypnotic, and gradually fatigue overcame everyone inside, except for Clint, who remained focused. Natasha broke the silence, looking at Clint, who still had his serious and concentrated expression on the Quinjet's controls. Clint, how long until we reach this place? She asked, breaking the silence. Clint looked at the monitors in front of him and answered with a firm voice. About another 30 minutes. Rest while you can, it's going to be a long journey ahead. With this information, the heroes settled into their seats and tried to relax as much as they could. The Quinjet continued its quiet journey through the sky, carrying a team of tired superheroes. After a brief pause, the conversation turned to the memories of the battle they had just faced. Each team member shared their perspectives and concerns as the Quinjet continued its peaceful flight. Steve looked at Peter and said, "You did a great job out there, kid." Peter smiled, grateful for Steve's praise. "Thank you, Captain. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm working on it." The rest of the flight proceeded quietly, with the team chatting and making small talk. Finally, the Quinjet had landed in an isolated location in the middle of a forest. They disembarked from the aircraft and began to walk through the flowers, eventually arriving at a farm. "What place is this?" Thor asked, looking around. "A safe haven," Tony said as he walked alongside Pete. Clint looked at them and tried to explain where they were. "This is my home. Here, we'll be away from prying eyes. You can rest, replenish, and recover." As they approached the house on the farm, Clint opened the door and ushered everyone inside. "Honey, I'm home." After Clint called out, a pregnant woman in a floral shirt appeared. This was Laura Barton, Clint's wife. Sorry, I didn't have time to warn you. We have visitors. Clint said, approaching Laura and giving her a kiss. No problem. Laura replied, smiling at the heroes. You're all welcome in our home. She's a new agent. Tony said, looking at Thor. Everyone, meet Laura Barton. Clint said, introducing his wife. You can clap if you want. Clint continued, eliciting laughter from everyone in the room. I know all your names, but I've never seen you before. Laura said, pointing her finger in Peter's direction. Because I'm new to the team. Peter said with a somewhat embarrassed expression. That's right, joined a few days ago, but you're already leaving. Tony said with a serious expression. After Tony said those words, footsteps could be heard upstairs. A few seconds passed, and two children came down the stairs and jumped on Barton. They were his kids. And these are definitely junior agents. Tony said. The little girl started to look at all the heroes in the room and began searching for Natasha. When she found her, she ran toward her and hugged her, showing how much she had missed her. Sorry for showing up like this. Steve said, looking at Laura. The agent would have called, but we were busy without even knowing you existed. Tony said with a touch of irony in his voice, looking at Laura and then at Barton. Sorry for that, but I asked Nick to help me hide them when I joined S.H.I.E.L.D. I wanted to keep them hidden so they wouldn't get hurt. Clint said, looking at Tony. After the heroes settled in the living room, Laura called her kids, who were still with their father, and asked them to introduce themselves. Hello, I'm Lila. The younger girl said, bowing as a sign of respect. I'm Cooper. The older boy said, following his sister's lead. Thor, who had been quiet until then, began to remember the visions he had of Asgard when he was under Wanda's spell, the many parties, drinks, and orgies. Unable to take it any longer, he went outside the house but was followed by Steve. Thor, did something happen? Steve said, getting Thor's attention. In my dream, I saw something, and I want answers about it, but I won't find them here. Thor said with a serious expression, swinging Mjolnir and walking away. As for Peter, he had returned to the Quinjet to change his torn and destroyed uniform from the tough battle against the Hulk. After leaving the Quinjet, he headed toward a room to try to fix his web shooters, which he thought had just run out of web fluid, but he soon realized the problem was a bit more complex. Peter was concentrating on fixing his web launchers when the bedroom door opened softly and Steve walked in. Captain America looked at the young hero and noticed his expression of determination. What's up, kid? Steve said as he approached Peter. Is it still fixed? Steve continued, now looking at the launchers. I don't know yet, I hope so. Peter said without taking his eyes off the device. Chapter 25, Mind in Conflict. I hope you can fix them. Well. I just came here to see how you were doing. Said Steve, now getting Peter's attention. I'm okay, Cap. Replied Peter with a forced smile that went unnoticed by Steve. All right then, if you need anything, just reach out to me. Said Steve as he turned and headed toward the door, but Peter called him before he could open it. Captain. Peter got Steve's attention, who turned to face him. Is something wrong? Steve asked, looking at the young man with a curious expression. It's nothing, it's just that I heard Tony say I might have to leave. Is it true that you guys are going to send me away? Said Peter with a downcast expression, looking at Steve. I saw what happened yesterday, and I appreciate it. Steve said but was interrupted by Peter. So, why can't I stay? You saw, I'm strong. Peter said as he looked into Steve's eyes, who stared back at him seriously before continuing. I saw that you're strong and a responsible kid, but, you nearly died yesterday, and I can't allow that, especially seeing a kid almost getting hurt by getting involved in matters that we should handle. Steve continued speaking as he looked at Peter with a serious face. Peter nodded, understanding Steve's concerns but still feeling apprehensive. I admit that what happened yesterday was my fault. Peter said with a serious face, pausing before continuing. I should have just stopped them from doing what they did yesterday, but instead, I tried to act like a moralist with them. I understand that you tried to do the right thing, kid, but we have to ensure the safety of citizens who can't defend themselves. We wouldn't forgive ourselves if a child got hurt by getting involved in our affairs. Steve said as he looked at Peter before continuing. But I'm not a child anymore, I'm almost 16. Peter tried to change Steve's opinion. For me, it doesn't make a difference, I still see you as a child. Steve continued with a serious face, still looking at Peter. I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't have meddled in this story, I even tried to avoid getting involved, but it was stronger than me. Peter said with an embarrassed expression. Steve looked at Peter with a gentler look, recognizing the young man's sincerity. He knew that Peter had good intentions, and in a way, his involvement had also been beneficial. You don't need to apologize, kid. I should be thanking you now. If it weren't for you, Ultron would probably have killed Dr. Cho. I also owe you some apologies for getting you into this mess. Peter looked surprised at Steve, not expecting this kind of response from Captain America. He felt relieved but was still worried about the possibility of being removed from the team. Thank you, Captain. This means a lot to me. Peter said with a grateful smile before continuing. Do I really have to go? I really wanted to stay. Steve sighed once again, weighing the situation. He didn't want to take the kid off the team, but he also didn't want to risk his safety. I understand that you want to help, kid. And believe me, I would love to have you with us. But we need to ensure that you're safe. Steve said before continuing. We've already decided, tomorrow we'll take you back home. Steve was about to finish his sentence when he noticed the disappointed look on Peter's face. The young hero had become attached to the idea of being part of the team, and the prospect of going back home was disheartening. Steve continued to look at Peter and spoke again. So, you can have your peaceful life as a vigilante again. Of course, if nothing goes wrong. Steve whispered this last part in a way that Peter couldn't hear. Peter lowered his head for a moment, looking resigned, but then raised his eyes to Steve with determination. All right, but I wanted to thank you for letting me help you, even if it was for a short time. Thank you, Captain. It was an honor to have been able to fight alongside you. Steve squeezed Peter's shoulder with a comforting smile, appreciating the young hero's mature attitude. The honor was ours, kid. You showed great courage and determination. Be responsible and keep training. Who knows, one day, when you're more prepared, you might be able to join us again. After saying those words, Steve, with a smile on his face, began to slowly move away from Peter, heading towards the door, and then opening it and leaving the room. Peter stood there, deep in thought about what he should do, whether he should stay and help the Avengers with this problem or go back to his life as the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. When Steve left the room, Peter was left with mixed emotions. He understood Captain America's concerns and the need to prioritize his safety, but it was still difficult for him to accept leaving the Avengers, even if it was only a temporary arrangement. Peter was torn between his sense of responsibility and his desire to continue fighting alongside these incredible heroes. What should I do? Should I just leave, or should I stay like this? Peter thought as he paced back and forth in the room. After pacing around the room and not getting any answers, he starts walking towards the window. There, he looks down and sees Tony and Steve chopping wood. In fact, Tony was talking more than chopping wood, while Steve wasn't even using an axe, he was using his hands to split the logs in half. How could I compare to these two? They're incredible, and what they've achieved is surreal. Who am I kidding? I'll never be their equal, one is a super soldier and the other is a super genius and billionaire, while I'm just a little boy from Queens. Peter said these words to himself while still watching Tony and Steve through the window. Chapter 26, Revelations and the Nexus Alliance. After a few minutes of self-critique, Peter decided to reach for the cell phone in the back pocket of his shorts. Upon unlocking the phone's screen, he was greeted with a picture of his Aunt May and his late Uncle Ben. The image brought a melancholic smile to his face as he remembered his uncle's words, "With great power comes great responsibility." The photo was more than just a memory, it was a constant reminder of the promise he had made to his uncle after his death. In that dark moment when tragedy shook his family, Peter swore to use his powers to protect the innocent, fight crime, and ensure that no one else would suffer as his Aunt May had. He knew that, as Spider-Man, he carried both a gift and a curse, the power to make a difference but also the responsibility to confront the evil that plagued the city. No matter what I do, or how hard I try, those I love will always pay. With great power comes great responsibility. This is my gift and also the curse I bear. Who am I? You already know me, or you've heard of me. I am Spider-Man. Determined and resolute in facing his fears, Peter decided not to run away and chose to stay and join the Avengers to support them in whatever was necessary. "I won't run anymore, I made a promise, and I won't break it," Peter said, his eyes shining, displaying his determination. "But I think I'll deal with this tomorrow, after all, a little rest won't kill anyone," Peter whispered, somewhat embarrassed, as he lay on the bed. Some time later. Living room. 7:40 p.m. All the Avengers were gathered in the living room. However, there were two differences in that room. First, Peter, who had not yet come downstairs and was in his room. The second was the presence of the former S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, Nick Fury. After the events of The Winter Soldier, he had faked his own death to hide from threats within S.H.I.E.L.D. Clint, seeing that Nick needed a safe haven, allowed him to hide in his residence as a way to repay what he had done for him. While Nick Fury spoke, his serious face began to reflect the gravity of the situation. "Ultron was clever. To buy time, he took you out of the game," Nick said, with a serious look, gazing directly at Steve. "I've talked to some of my contacts, and they've told me that, due to the amount of vibranium he stole, it's very likely that he's building something big." Nick continued, now directing his gaze to the entire team. The Avengers exchanged worried glances. Steve asked with seriousness, "Have you found his location?" Everyone was eager for a lead to track Ultron. Nick replied, maintaining a serious expression. "He's not even trying to hide, he's everywhere. The guy multiplies more than shadow clones, that's easy to find, but still, we can't get any idea of his plans." Tension in the room increased after those words, and Tony, seeing this, decided to intervene, asking, "What about the nuclear codes? Does he still want them?" As he spoke, he attempted to hit a dart into a wall, showing his restlessness. Fury looked directly at Tony and replied, "He already has the codes, but he's not doing anything with them." Uncertainty about Ultron's intentions hung over everyone as they tried to find a way to anticipate and thwart the villain's plans. The minutes that followed were filled with tense silence in the Avengers' living room. Each team member was immersed in their own thoughts, pondering the threat posed by Ultron and what would be required to stop him. Finally, Steve Rogers decided to break the silence. "We need to act quickly and intelligently. Ultron is a threat we can't underestimate, and we can't afford to wait for his next moves. I've hacked into the Pentagons for you, did you know that?" Tony said now, looking in Nick's direction. After Tony's revelation about his ability to hack into the Pentagon system, the looks turned to Nick Fury, who maintained his serious expression. Nick replied, "I know. We've contacted our friends at Nexus for additional information on Ultron's movements." "Nexus? Who are they?" Steve asked with a curious face. Nexus is a worldwide internet organization based in Washington. They're like a global network of intelligence and security. Every bit of information goes through there, it's the fastest access on Earth. Bruce said, still somewhat downcast. "Does that mean we'll have eyes and ears in places we normally couldn't reach?" Steve asked, looking at Nick. Nick just nodded and directed his gaze towards Steve. "Exactly. Nexus has the capability to access information and track activities at levels we couldn't achieve alone. They also have their own technical resources and highly trained agents." "And what did they say, are they going to help us?" Clint asked as he picked up a dart. Nick Fury maintained his serious expression as he answered Clint. "They agreed to provide assistance. However, they said they'd focus only on the missiles since Ultron is constantly changing the codes." "Who's changing the codes?" Tony asked as he dodged a dart that Clint had thrown at him. "They don't know either, but from what I've been told, it's some unknown group," Nick said, looking at Tony. "Could it be an ally, trying to help us?" Nat asked, looking at Nick. "I highly doubt it, but one thing is certain, Ultron has an enemy trying to undermine him, and I'd pay all the money in the world to know who that person is," Fury said as he sipped his juice and ate a roll. "Maybe I need to visit our friends in Washington to find out who this unknown is," Tony said as he approached the others. "Boss, that meeting was great, but coming from you, I expected a plan, I don't know, something more concrete, and not these simple assumptions," Nat said, still looking at Nick. Chapter 27, Strategic Meeting. "But I have a plan, I have you," said Nick Fury, taking a brief pause before continuing, with his gaze fixed on each of them. You might not even remember, but I used to have eyes everywhere, and I also had ears in every corner. You had cutting-edge technology, and now, look at us, here we all are on Earth again, with no resources and no technology, only with our intelligence and our will to save the world." He took a deep breath before continuing, emphasizing the gravity of the situation. Ultron isn't dumb, he knows the Avengers are the only thing standing between him and his plan. Even if he doesn't admit it, his mission is global destruction, and if that happens, it'll be the end of everything we have. So, stop moping around and stand up. Nick Fury began to walk and sat down in a chair before continuing. You have a mission, so quit slacking and go kick that silver-haired bastard's behind. After Nick Fury said those words, a door behind them opened, and out walked Peter. Tony, upon noticing Peter's presence, turned to him and asked, "Where were you, kid?" Peter responded, displaying his web shooters. "I was in my room, trying to fix this." He pointed to his equipment, indicating his willingness to help with the mission. However, Peter couldn't resist making a playful jab at Captain America, teasing Steve with a smile. Cap doesn't like that language. "Seriously, Parker, even you?" Steve said, feigning a sad face and joining in the banter. Nick Fury then redirected the discussion back to the mission, asking, "But what does he want?" As he looked at the group, his expression remained serious to better understand the situation. Peter stepped forward and began to explain, maintaining a serious and focused tone. Ultron wants to reset the world, eliminating a large part of humanity. He believes that humans are the cause of the planet's problems and that purification is necessary. He intends to use the technology he has to improve his body. He wants to be better than us. And before someone asks how I know all this, I did some research. Upon hearing all of that, Steve furrowed his brow. He couldn't help but feel a sense of dismay at the potential consequences. It's a complicated situation, we can't underestimate what Ultron is capable of. Steve commented with a serious expression. Ultron wants to enhance his own body. He knows that the human form is inefficient, as biologically we are outdated. Tony added to Peter's words while keeping his arms crossed, with his eyes fixed on Nick. Peter began to walk slowly toward the table where Natasha was sitting and observed a butterfly drawing on the table. It seems that when you programmed him to protect the human race, something went wrong in the process. Natasha said with a hint of sarcasm in her voice while looking at Bruce and then at Tony. The human race doesn't need protection, quite the opposite, it needs to evolve. And, apparently, the old Tin can realize that, so he's trying to evolve. Peter said, still looking at the drawing on the table and then looking at everyone in the group. How is that possible? And how would he be evolving, kid? Nick said, holding a glass, and looking at Peter. Has anyone here made contact with Dr. Cho after that incident at the tower? Peter asked, looking at everyone in the room. Nick Fury looked closely at Peter after his last question about Dr. Cho. Natasha, who was intrigued by Peter's words, decided to answer the question. We tried to contact Dr. Cho after the incident at the tower, but we didn't get a response. It seems like she disappeared or was taken by Ultron. We're not sure. Peter nodded, confirming his suspicions. It seems that Ultron is using Dr. Cho to create his new body. He's manipulating all the resources he has available to fulfill his plan. Some time later. In Ultron's lab. Ultron had stolen vibranium to build a perfect body that was immune to any kind of damage and more advanced than any human. To accomplish this, he would use the Mind Stone, and to complete this plan, he made contact with Dr. Helen Cho and controlled her using the power of the stone to force her to work on a new body for him. After a lot of work, Ultron had finally managed to build his new body. He opened the crib's lid where the body lay, and after Dr. Cho saw the body, she said, "He's beautiful." She began to approach the crib and looked at a panel that contained some information about the body, including what it was made of. The atoms of vibranium not only are compatible with the body's tissue cells but also bond with them. S.H.I.E.L.D. could never have imagined that. Helen Cho said, looking at the panel but was interrupted by Ultron. That it was the most adaptable substance on the planet, but look at them, they used it to make a frisbee, that's typical of humans. Ultron said as he began to walk toward the scepter, where the Mind Stone was. They only think about scratching the surface of things, but never about what's really inside that surface. Ultron said, taking the Mind Stone and placing it on the new body's forehead. You did a good job, Dr. Cho. However, I won't be needing your services anymore. Ultron said, turning to the scientist with a cynical smile on his face. Helen Cho, surprised and afraid, tried to protest. However, before she could say anything, Ultron unleashed a blast of energy from his hands, which hit her, causing her to fall to the ground unconscious. You're just another pawn for me to achieve my goals. Ultron declared coldly as he approached the crib where his new body was. With Dr. Cho unconscious on the floor, Ultron took one last look at her newly created body. His cold, calculating expression indicated that he was about to begin his plan. He reached out towards the cradle and, with a touch of the mind gem, yellow lines began to run throughout his body, speeding up the process of cell regeneration. Chapter 28, An Unexpected Request. At Clint's house. After the conversation that took place among everyone and Nick Fury, the decision was made. They were going to invade the base where Ultron was hiding, with the goal of retrieving the body that the villain had created. While each one was preparing for the mission, Steve went to a corner of the room, picked up his shield from the floor, and strapped it to his back. Steve began to walk slowly towards the exit of the house, his mind filled with thoughts about the mission they were about to undertake, when he finally encountered Tony, who was also heading out of the house. I intend to take Natasha and Clint with me, declared Steve, approaching Tony and accompanying him. Suddenly, Peter unexpectedly appeared in the room and said, I'm going to join Captain on this mission. Upon hearing that, Steve and Tony exchanged glances, expressing reluctance on their faces as they tried to find the right words to respond to the boy. At that moment, Tony looked at Steve with a serious expression on his face. He began to consider the situation, aware that Peter's participation in the mission could entail additional risks. However, Peter was determined to prove his worth. Steve looked at Peter and sighed, understanding the young man's motivation and determination to help. He knew that sometimes we're forced to mature faster than we'd like, especially in times of crisis. Kid, we've already discussed this, remember? Steve said, looking at Peter with a serious expression. Peter maintained his steadfast gaze, staring at Steve with determination. He knew that this mission was his opportunity to show that he was more than just an inexperienced kid. I know, and that's why I decided to go with you, Peter said with determination on his face before continuing. Captain, I know what I'm doing. I've already lost my uncle because of my mistake, and I couldn't forgive myself for it. That anger consumed me and made me want to deliver justice with my own hands. After I found myself again, I decided to become Spider-Man. I'm not what I am today because I think it's cool or fun, but because the only thing standing between safety and these people is me. As long as Spider-Man exists, I won't let anyone else die. Upon hearing that, everyone present was deeply impressed by Peter's remarkable attitude, which showed courage and determination in the face of the situation. Are you sure about this, Pete? This mission will be dangerous, Natasha cautioned, expressing her concern for the boy. Peter looked at Natasha with confidence and determination, responding to her concern with conviction. I'm sure, Natasha. I know it's dangerous, but I have to do it, and furthermore, I'm going to face Ultron alone this time. Okay, now you're exaggerating, kid. Do you remember what that guy did to all of us? Let me refresh your memory. He beat us up, and you're telling me you're going to face him alone? Tony asked, now with a more serious look. Yes, because I saw that you guys couldn't defeat him, so now it's my turn, Peter replied, looking firmly at Tony. Steve, curious, couldn't help but ask. What do you mean? I don't understand. Peter turned to Steve to explain why he was the right person to face Ultron. I have a little suspicion that Mr. Stark, Peter said, looking at Tony, built Ultron using your fighting style, and that's where I come in. Ultron has no knowledge of my fighting style. Steve and Tony exchanged looks, starting to understand Peter's perspective. The idea that Ultron might not be prepared to face someone with a completely different and adaptable fighting style intrigued them both. You have a point, but what's your fighting style? Steve asked, still evaluating Peter's proposal. I can kind of replicate what I see. How do you think I defeated all those robots and saved the civilians? It's because I copied your moves when I saw you on TV. Peter explained with enthusiasm, demonstrating unwavering confidence in his abilities. Peter believed that this ability was his advantage against Ultron since the villain had no knowledge of his unique and adaptable fighting style, making him an unpredictable opponent. Steve and Tony exchanged looks again, impressed with the boy's cleverness. Tony, still concerned about Peter's safety, retorted. "All right, kid, you're coming, but if something goes wrong, I want you to go home, no questions asked. Understand?" Peter nodded seriously, understanding Tony's concern and accepting the condition. "I understand, Mr. Stark. You won't regret it." Steve, seeing Peter's determination and confidence, also offered his support. "Well, if you're willing to face Ultron and believe you can make a difference, then we'll have you by our side. But remember, safety comes first." Now, with the team composed of Steve, Tony, Natasha, and Clint, they prepared for the mission. Peter was the only one missing, as he had returned to the Quinjet to retrieve his suit, so the team would be complete. Try to avoid any conflicts. This mission is just for reconnaissance. Once I gather some data in the Nexus, I'll meet up with you," Tony said as he walked alongside Steve. "If Ultron is really building a new body," Steve began, making a brief pause that Tony completed. "He'll be much stronger than any of us. Who would have thought? An android being built by a robot." Steve just looked at Tony and nodded before saying, "I still miss the time when I was the only weird thing science created." After Steve said those words, Nick Fury appeared. "I'll leave Dr. Banner at the tower, and if anything happens, only you contact me," Nick said, putting on his black coat and looking at Tony and Steve. "Would you mind if I took Miss Hill with me?" Nick continued, now looking at Tony. "You can take her and all of yours. As always," said Tony, in a sarcastic way that didn't go unnoticed by Nick. Chapter 29, Clash of Ideals. Nick Fury cast a discerning look at Tony, recognizing the sarcasm but choosing not to be provoked. "Good luck to all of you. Keep the communicator on, and if anything goes wrong, get out of there as fast as possible," Fury advised, looking at both Tony and Steve. "And you, what are you going to do?" Steve asked, looking at Fury. Nick Fury shrugged and started to slowly walk away from the two with an enigmatic smile on his face. Before he left the door, he turned around and answered Steve's question. "I haven't decided yet. Who knows, something dramatic." After Nick left the house, Tony and Steve continued discussing the plan. A few seconds later, they also left the house and headed to the Quinjet, where everyone was already seated in their places, only missing them. Tony approached Peter, who was in a more remote corner. "Did you manage to make any improvements on those web shooters, kid?" Tony asked, approaching Peter. "I made some basic modifications, just added a few spider touches to them," Peter said, showing the small modifications he had made to the web shooters. After that, the jet took off and headed towards what could be Ultron's hideout. Some time later. Genetics Lab. Seoul, Korea. Ultron had returned to Korea, where he had left Dr. Helen unconscious. Meanwhile, inside the laboratory, Dr. Cho began to regain consciousness. She got up slowly and realized she was on the ground. Her memory began to slowly return, and she remembered Ultron's attack and the threat she had created when under the influence of the Mind Stone. Determined to stop Ultron from completing his plans, Helen began to look for a way to contact the Avengers. She remembered the communicator that Steve had left with her. She then got up and went to a table with a drawer. Upon opening it, she found the communicator. When she was about to pick up the object, someone else appeared behind her. "If I were you, I wouldn't do that," said the voice, pointing a ray in her direction. Hearing the voice coming from a dark corner, Helen turned around and faced Ultron, who still had the ray pointed at her. "Please, don't kill me," Helen pleaded with a frightened face. "I won't do anything to you, as long as you don't try anything either, because I could have killed you that night, but I chose not to do anything," Ultron explained, lowering his hand. Helen, now a little less scared, looked at Ultron and said, "Are you expecting some gratitude?" "No. I just hope you understand why I chose to let you live," Ultron replied, with his eye shining in the darkness. 20 minutes later. Cellular cohesion should take a few hours, but we can start the consciousness transfer process by uploading your brain matrix to the new body, Helen said, plugging a cable behind Ultron's head. While Helen was in the lab, focused on the task of initiating the transfer of Ultron's consciousness to his new body, the Maximoff twins appeared in the room. Wanda began to approach the crib where Ultron's new body was located. I can read it, it looks like he's dreaming. Wanda commented as she slowly approached the crib. I wouldn't call it a dream. It's just Ultron's basic consciousness about his last fractional noise, so. Helen began to explain but was interrupted by Ultron. So, when? Sorry, I don't want to rush anyone. Ultron said, turning to Helen. I still don't know, as we're trying to create a physical brain, which takes time, and there are no shortcuts for that. Helen said, looking at Ultron. While the process of transferring Ultron's consciousness to his new body was underway, Wanda observed Ultron's new body with curiosity. She approached the crib and touched the capsule, leading her to a disturbing vision of the world's destruction. Wanda, shaken by the vision she had when touching the capsule of Ultron's new body, recoiled abruptly. Her eyes were wide with shock, and she was breathing rapidly, trying to regain her composure. Pietro, concerned, approached her and placed a hand on her shoulder. Wanda, what did you see? Are you okay? Pietro asked, looking at her with concern. Wanda looked at Ultron with frightened eyes and said. How could you? What do you mean? I don't understand. Ultron said, pretending not to understand what Wanda was talking about. You said you were going to make a better world, but what I saw there was just death and destruction. Wanda said, still trembling from the vision she had. But, it will be better. Ultron said, trying to calm Wanda. How will it be better? With you committing genocide. Wanda said, looking at Ultron with a mix of anger and despair before continuing. Is this your idea of a better world? Killing innocent people. Ultron seemed contemplative for a moment before responding. Sometimes, to create something better, it's necessary to clean up what doesn't work. Humanity is its own threat, and I'm just trying to rid the world of that flaw. Only then will these flawed humans have the opportunity to evolve. Ultron continued, looking at Wanda. And what if humanity doesn't evolve? Wanda asked, staring at Ultron with a skeptical look. Ultron looked at Wanda with his eyes shining and remained silent for a while before responding with a cold tone. I don't know, ask Noah. Upon hearing that mockery from Ultron, Wanda looked at him with a serious face and said. You're insane. Do you think you're some kind of god? Wanda questioned Ultron with a serious voice. Ultron, with his enigmatic aura, didn't seem bothered by Wanda's serious tone. He tilted his head slightly and responded with an ironic smile. Multiple extinction events have occurred before the age of dinosaurs, and every time the Earth starts to adjust, God throws a stone at it. Believe me. He'll throw another one, and it's just a matter of time. That's why we need to evolve. Ultron said, approaching the crib and putting his hand on the box. Chapter 30, The Cradle. Wanda, realizing that Ultron was up to something, creates a small red energy sphere and hurls it towards Dra. Helen, who ends up losing control of the Mind Stone. And you think you have the right to evolve humanity? Pietro questioned, his face filled with anger, staring at Ultron. Ultron, in turn, showed no sign of hesitation. He just looked at Pietro and retorted with his arrogant voice. Evolution is inevitable. I am just the catalyst, the hand that will guide humanity to its next stage. Upon hearing that, Pietro looked at his sister and realized the grave mistake they had made. Before Ultron could say anything, he sensed a presence approaching the laboratory. They're coming, declared Ultron, directing his gaze to a corner of the room. They're coming here, we have to be fast. Ultron ordered Dr. Helen to continue the process. I'm almost done, she said, now free from the control of the Mind Stone, pretending to cooperate with Ultron but actually heading towards the computer to sabotage his plan. Noticing something different in the transfer, Ultron turned to Dr. Helen. Really, did you do this? Saying this with a calm voice, Ultron shot a burst of energy towards Dr. Cho, who was hit squarely by the attack and fell unconscious to the ground. Witnessing Ultron's cruelty, Pietro realized that Ultron was not what he expected. He wasn't the person who could bring peace, but rather someone who would destroy everything. Seeing the error they had made, Pietro grabbed his sister and fled. Children, wait, I didn't kill her. She's just sleeping, said Ultron as he watched Pietro take Wanda and leave. Now that we've come to this point, kill everyone. Ultron telepathically commanded his robots, who began a true massacre in the laboratory, killing all the scientists present in the building. In the heat of the confrontation, Pietro, holding his sister firmly, ran through the laboratory corridors, escaping the growing carnage unleashed by Ultron's robots. Meanwhile, Wanda looked back, witnessing the chaos her intervention had triggered. Inside the Quinjet. Inside the aircraft, Peter was in a slightly secluded corner, preparing for the fight. He was attaching his new web shooters to his wrist and putting on his uniform. "Kid, here's the deal, let's try to avoid any unnecessary conflict. Our priority here is to gather as much information as possible, understand?" Steve said as he approached Peter. Peter said nothing, just nodded his head understanding what Steve meant. "We're not going to dance with him, we're just going in, grabbing the body, and getting out of there," Clint affirmed, approaching Peter. "Understood," said Peter, looking at both Steve and Clint. While Steve and Clint provided information to Peter, Natasha began to approach him. "Are you sure you want to do this? There's still time to change your mind," Natasha said, still concerned. Peter looked into Natasha's eyes, expressing determination. "I'm absolutely sure." Natasha sighed briefly, realizing that nothing she said would change Peter's mind. "Since you're so determined, who am I to stop you? Take this," Natasha said, handing a device to Peter. As he held the object in his hands, Peter looked at Natasha and asked with a curious expression on his face. "What is this?" "This is a communicator. If something goes wrong, get in touch with us." "Got it," Natasha said, now less worried, looking at Peter. "Affirmative, Mrs. Romanoff," Peter said, saluting and eliciting some laughs from Natasha. "It's not that serious," she commented, almost laughing. After the four arrived at their destination, Clint landed the Quinjet in a somewhat remote area but still close to Ultron's laboratory. The ramp lowered, and from inside, Peter emerged, leaving only Steve, Clint, and Natasha. "Guys, let me see if I understand," Peter said as he stared at the three in front of him. Steve said nothing, just nodded, indicating for Peter to continue. "You want me to hold Ultron for 2 minutes?" Steve looked at Peter, nodding with seriousness. "That's right, kid. If he's still in there, keep him busy for those 2 minutes while we try to get the body. Understand?" "Yes, Captain." "Understood," Peter said, looking at Steve. After finalizing the plan details with Steve, Peter began walking towards the laboratory. Upon entering the place, he proceeded with caution, attentive to every sound around him. As he advanced down the corridor, he was engulfed by a strong smell of blood, alerting his senses. Reaching the end of the corridor, he was met with a shocking scene. The laboratory transformed into a scene of true carnage. Several lifeless bodies on the floor, blood everywhere, some with body parts scattered, others with their guts exposed, a truly traumatizing event. However, amidst the macabre landscape, one body still moved, showing signs of life, albeit weak, Dr. Helen Cho, the woman Peter had managed to save in the Avengers Tower. "Dr. Cho, what happened here?" Peter asked as he approached her. Seeing the scientist's body covered in bruises and blood, Peter picked up a tissue from the table and began to clean the blood, which had probably sprayed from her deceased colleagues. Upon hearing Peter's voice, Dr. Cho opened her eyes, still tired, and with the little strength she had left, she looked at him and said with a weak and hoarse voice. "It was Ultron, he went mad. We need to stop him before he can transfer into the new body." "But where is he going?" Peter asked while helping the scientist to stand. Dr. Helen, already too weak to speak, just pointed her finger in the direction of a panel displaying information about where Ultron was heading. As Peter was about to leave the room, Helen picked up his clothes and spoke. "Be careful. The gem has granted immeasurable power to that body, and if Ultron manages to transfer it to him, it will be the end of humanity. It's no use just blowing up the body, you must take the cradle to Tony Stark." Chapter 32, Chapter 31, Plan in Action. "And you? Not that I accompany you to a hospital, at least?" Peter asks, expressing his concern about the scientist's condition. "I can't afford that luxury, as I mentioned before. If Ultron gets his hands on that body, we're all lost. Besides, I'm fine, you don't need to worry," Helen said, still with some difficulty but with a mix of pain and despair on her face. Look, Doctor, I insist. I can't just leave you here in this state. Come on, I'll take you to the hospital, and then I'll go after Ultron. We can't risk your health like this. Peter insists, showing his concern. Helen smiles weakly, appreciating the hero's concern. I understand, but you can't let Ultron succeed in the transfer. If I go now, it might be too late. You need to solve this before it's too late. Peter sighs, realizing Helen's determination. You're stubborn, you know. But, okay, let's do it your way. After seeing that the doctor wouldn't give up, Peter gives in and starts running out of the room, heading towards the laboratory exit, but not before calling an ambulance. As he moved through the facility's corridors, he communicated with the other team members through the communicator. Leaving the laboratory, Peter shoots a web towards a building and swings until he reaches an overpass, where he stays up there just watching, waiting for Ultron or any suspicious action. Did you all hear everything? Peter says through the communicator, observing the activity below. We heard it, kid. Steve replies from the other end of the line. Pete, we've identified a private jet that should take off from the other side of the city. Natasha said while manipulating a holographic panel. And, as there's no record of this jet. Natasha continued but was interrupted by Clint, who completed her sentence. So, it must be him. Clint said, looking closely at the ground. Kid, a suspicious truck just left the lab and is heading your way. Clint said, still inside the Quinjet, monitoring the truck's movement. Understood. I'll approach to get a better view. Clint, keep an eye up there and let me know if you notice any suspicious movement. Peter said through the communicator. I just confirmed the information, it's them. Clint said, looking at the truck's data before continuing. There are 5 of them. Ultron and 2 more are guarding the cradle, and the other 2 are at the wheel. Leave the driver to me. Clint said, pointing the Quinjet's weapons at the driver. We can't do that. If the truck crashes, there will be many deaths. Steve said, stopping Clint with a serious expression. Damn, I had forgotten about that little detail. Clint said, now realizing the huge mistake he was about to make. So, we just have to lure the tin can out of the truck, simple. Peter said through the communicator, still on top of the overpass. You're right, but how can we get his attention? Curious, Clint asked. Peter watches the truck approaching, and after a moment of reflection, suggests through the communicator. Let's create a distraction. Natasha, see if you can hack the traffic lights on the truck's route. Steve, get ready to intercept any suspicious movement. Clint, be ready to act if something goes wrong with the plan. Natasha promptly responds. Understood. I'll see if I can access the traffic control system now. Meanwhile, Steve strategically positions himself near the overpass, ready to act. Suddenly, the traffic lights along the truck's route start flashing in disorder, causing confusion in traffic. The robot driving becomes somewhat confused but continues advancing. Clint, still inside the Quinjet, observed the situation and commented. The distraction is working, but they won't fall for it, so we must act quickly. Peter, still lurking on the overpass, waited for the right moment to act. As the truck approached, he shot a web in front of the vehicle, partially blocking the robot's view. Hey, tin can. We're confiscating this truck, you don't have a license, let alone permission to drive. Peter said, jumping onto the truck. Ultron, who was in the back of the truck with the cradle, noticed the interference from the Avengers and looked up with a hateful gaze. It seems we have unwanted visitors. Ultron said, still looking up. Angry now, Ultron shoots an energy burst upwards, opening a hole in the roof. Peter, who was on top of the truck, was only saved because his spider sense alerted him to danger, jumping backward and clinging to the truck's rear door. Why don't you leave me alone? Ultron shouted, now with more anger, firing another burst of energy, this time at the back of the truck where Peter was, thus opening the truck's doors. Seeing the person who ruined his plans clinging to the door, Ultron looks at Spider-Man with anger and fires another burst, this time almost hitting Peter. Just narrowly, he manages to dodge and holds onto the door attached to the truck. Apparently, he's not very happy to see me. Peter said through the communicator, seeing Ultron glaring at him with hatred. You humans always meddling where you're not called. Ultron said with disdain in his voice while staring at Spider-Man clinging to the truck. Peter, staying calm, responded ironically. Well, you didn't invite me for tea, so I had to invite myself. Now, how about we stop this talk and settle this once and for all? Be careful, kid. You're no match for him. Clint said from the other side of the communicator as encouragement. Thanks, Mr. Barton, for trusting me so much. Your sincerity moves me. Peter said ironically. Ultron, irritated by Spider-Man's presence, removes the cable connecting him to the body and decides to intensify his attacks, firing more energy bursts in an attempt to get rid of Peter, who, from the tower, has been thwarting his plans. Peter, agile, dodges all the bursts and jumps onto a car that was coming behind. While dodging, Peter starts shooting webs towards the truck to try to reach Ultron, but then... Do you know what's inside the cradle? The power to make real changes, and you fear that. Ultron proclaimed with disdain, keeping his attention focused on Spider-Man. Chapter 32, Peter vs. Ultron. Peter, now hanging onto a moving car, responded to Ultron with seriousness. We don't fear change. But the chaos you'll bring with it. Ultron let out a cynical laugh, belittling Spider-Man's words. You humans are so predictable. Always believing you can control the uncontrollable. After Ultron uttered those words, he attempted to shoot a beam towards the car where Peter was. However, Peter was quicker and managed to dodge. Right after, he shot a web towards Ultron. This time, the web not only hit Ultron but also triggered a powerful sound wave. Momentarily disoriented by the web and the sonic impact, Ultron looked sternly at Peter and declared. What have you done? Like my little gift. I call it the impact web. As the name suggests, it launches a powerful sound wave that can even flip a car. Peter said mockingly while taunting Ultron. Ultron, irritated by the unexpected turn of events, retorted with a cold expression. Interesting, but do you really believe this cheap trick will hold someone like me for long? While Ultron tried to free himself from the web, Peter seized the opportunity to get closer. You may be powerful, but you underestimate humanity too much. And that will be your downfall. Ultron, showing irony, replied. Your optimism moves me. If I could cry, I might even shed a tear, but unfortunately, I can't. Ultron, now more cautious, responded with disdain. Humanity is flawed and self-destructive. You yourselves are the real problem. Before Peter could counter, Ultron managed to break free using an energy pulse that tore the webs apart. Without second thoughts, Ultron tried to attack Peter again, this time launching several projectiles at him. Peter, as agile as ever, used his dexterity to dodge all the projectiles. While dodging, Peter saw a metal plate and had an idea. He grabbed the object and threw it at Ultron's chest. Then, he shot another web towards Ultron's eyes, obscuring his vision. After breaking free from the webs, Ultron unleashed another beam towards Peter, who, to avoid being hit, jumped onto the front of a truck. Inside the Quinjet. We have to do something. Natasha said worriedly about Peter. Okay, but what can we do? Clint asked, looking at Nat. I still don't know. Natasha said while looking around, focusing her gaze momentarily on Captain America's shield. I got it, Steve. What do you say? Natasha said while staring at Steve's shield, making him understand what she meant. I don't know, Nat. I find it too risky. Steve said, concerned for his teammate. Natasha ignored Steve's hesitations and grabbed his shield without waiting for his approval. She looked at Steve with determination and said, We've risked countless times, and if we don't take action, Peter may end up in danger. We need to act now. Encouraged by Natasha's determination, Steve was thoughtful for a moment but eventually gave in. Okay, you can go, but be very careful. Natasha nodded with Steve's temporary approval and, holding the shield firmly, headed to the back of the Quinjet. Clint followed, worried but determined to help. Be careful, okay? Clint said looking at Nat. Don't worry, I always take care of myself. Nat said as she headed towards a black motorcycle. Approaching a black motorcycle, Natasha quickly mounted it and adjusted Captain's shield on her back. With a nod to Clint, she accelerated towards the confrontation between Peter and Ultron. As Natasha sped through the city, skillfully weaving between cars and pedestrians, her gaze was focused on the clash between Peter and Ultron. Meanwhile, Clint, still in the air inside the Quinjet, communicated with Natasha through the communicator. "They're heading under the overpass. I won't be able to shoot," Clint said, warning Natasha that he would lose sight of Peter and Ultron. "What route should I take?" Nat asked for guidance. "Go straight, now turn left. When I say, turn right, wait, now," Clint said, guiding Natasha. Turning, Natasha came face to face with Peter applying a rear-naked choke on the villain. However, Ultron managed to free himself and grabbed Peter's neck, starting to choke him. But Natasha managed to arrive in time and drew the attention of both Peter and Ultron by throwing the shield for Peter to catch. "Cool, I always wanted to do that," Peter thought as he caught the shield and took the opportunity to free himself from Ultron's grip by hitting him with a punch using the shield. After receiving the blow and being pushed backward, Ultron saw Natasha coming right behind on a motorcycle. Looking at her with hatred, he lifted a piece of earth to block Natasha's path, but to no avail, and she continued following him. Seeing that he couldn't shake off Black Widow, Ultron, telepathically, ordered his robots to shoot at her to keep her busy. Returning his attention to Peter, Ultron managed to hit him with an energy burst, trying to defend himself with the shield, but to no avail, and ended up being thrown towards a car. Seeing that Peter would take a while to recover, Ultron lifted another piece of earth to cause an accident. "Oh no. Not on my watch, tin can," Peter whispered as he took out a kind of web grenade. "Hope this works," Peter thought with a worried look as he threw the grenade towards the falling cars, but before they fell, the grenade exploded, releasing a huge web that caught all the cars, preventing them from falling. "That's it. Nailed it," Peter said, getting a bit excited. "Stay focused, kid," Natasha said, coming right behind on the motorcycle. "Sorry, got carried away," Peter said with a somewhat embarrassed look. Natasha continued following Peter and Ultron, skillfully dodging through the city's obstacles. Meanwhile, Clint, still in the Quinjet, kept a watchful eye and communicated with Natasha. "They're heading towards the city center. Be prepared for possible traps," Clint warned, keeping Natasha informed about the situation. "Understood," Natasha replied, adjusting her route according to Clint's information. Chapter 33, Unexpected Allies. Back to the showdown, Peter, who had stayed behind after saving the cars, manages to swing between the buildings and finally reach the truck once again. Upon arrival, the already enraged Ultron greets Peter with punches and energy blasts, which Peter easily either defends with the shield or uses the shield as a weapon. After long sessions of genuine punch trading between Peter and Ultron, where at one moment one would strike, and in the next, the other would take a hit, they finally emerged from under the overpass. As Peter and Ultron move away from the overpass, Clint, who was still airborne and a few meters away from the two, begins to shoot several point-blank projectiles in Ultron's direction to distract the villain, who becomes even more irritated and orders his guards to go after the Quinjet to bring it down. Not far away, Wanda and Pietro were walking down the street when they saw on TV what was happening on the other side of the city. "Isn't that the guy facing Ultron, the so-called Spider-Man? This guy must be crazy. First, he tries to face Hulk and almost gets hurt, and now he's facing Ultron. Soon, he'll want to lift Thor's hammer too, right, Wanda?" said Pietro, realizing that his sister was lost in her own thoughts. Wanda, who was completely focused on Peter's fight against Ultron, didn't even hear what her brother had said. However, watching that fight, Wanda felt encouraged by the courage and strength of the boy their age. "Pietro, we have to help him," said Wanda, now turning and looking at her brother. "What? What do you mean, Wanda? We left there not to get involved in all this trouble, remember?" said Pietro, confused, not understanding what his sister meant. "I know, but half of this is our fault. And we can't just ignore it," said Wanda, staring at her brother with determination before continuing. "Do you remember the tragedy with the Hulk and what Ultron is doing? All of this is our fault." Pietro rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed. "You're letting your emotions control you again, Wanda. It never ends well. I know we messed up, but we joined the Avengers and accepted everything Tony did against us, against our family." Pietro continued, letting out a long sigh, visibly uncomfortable with his sister's insistence. "Do you remember what that boy, who is now trying to save the world, told us?" asked Wanda, looking at her brother. "No, Wanda. I don't remember," What did he say? Said Pietro, not understanding where his sister was going. He said that sometimes it's better to stop thinking about ourselves and think more about others. In other words, we should put aside our revenge for now and help those people who might end up dying because of the mistake we made by aligning ourselves with Ultron. Said Wanda, trying to convince her brother anyway. Pietro sighed deeply, reflecting on Wanda's words. Still reluctant, he looked at the TV and saw images of the battle between Peter and Ultron. All right, Wanda. Let's go help, but after this, we're out of this for good. Wanda nodded gratefully, and the two siblings headed towards the scene of the confrontation. Back to the fight. The fight between Peter and Ultron had intensified to a point where it was already causing significant damage to the city. Due to a slip by Ultron, Peter seized the opportunity to throw the villain towards a beam. However, it was not enough as Ultron quickly recovered and landed a punch to Peter's face, causing him to recoil from the impact. Ultron, thinking Peter was disoriented, tried to attack again. But this time, Peter not only managed to dodge but also counterattacked, throwing Ultron in the direction of a passing train behind them. While the fight continued inside the train, the passengers in the cars sought a safe place to take cover. Some hid under the seats, while others sought refuge in other cars. Natasha, on the other hand, saw the robots that were previously chasing Clint now coming towards her because of the cradle. Every time Peter and Ultron's punches collided, the impact generated could be heard throughout the length of the cars. Nat, they're coming back in your direction. If you're going to do something, I suggest you do it now. Clint warned his friend about the danger approaching her. After several hours of punch trading, Peter finally found an opening and, once again, deployed the impact web. However, this time, instead of causing no harm to Ultron, the impact did some damage and knocked him down for a moment. I know, I'm getting into the truck. Pete, can you keep him busy for a few minutes while I steal the cradle? Natasha said, responding to Clint's question and then switching communication to Peter. And what do you think I'm trying to do, Ms. Romanoff? Peter said sarcastically while dodging a punch from Ultron. After Natasha successfully infiltrated the truck, the robots that were once chasing Clint started heading towards the vehicle. In total, 4 robots approached Natasha. She managed to destroy 2 with great effort but did not notice the other 2, which ended up clinging to the truck and lifting it off the ground with their thrusters, starting to fly with it. Inside the moving train, Peter continued his confrontation with Ultron, seizing every opportunity to deliver blows and keep the villain occupied. Ultron, in turn, was determined to defeat Spider-Man and redirected his attention to Natasha, who was now inside the truck trying to steal the cradle. Returning to Natasha, she realized the tricky situation she was in when the robots clung to the vehicle and lifted it off the ground. She grabbed onto a safety bar to stay stable while assessing her options. Clint, who was still flying nearby, noticed the suspicious movement of the truck in the air and appeared behind it with the Quinjet ready to shoot. The package is in the air and it's in my sights. Do I have permission to shoot? Clint asked Natasha through the communicator. Natasha, holding on tightly to the safety bar of the moving truck, quickly replied to Clint via the communicator. Negative, I'm still inside this flying thing.